Hello, and welcome to Boundless and Bottomless Seas here on Varnblog, and I am here with Darnold Parkinson of Marxist Unity Group, Cosmonaut Magazine. What else are you doing these days? Democratic Left? Bunch of stuff.
Yes, I'm on the editorial board of DSA's official publication, Democratic Left. And I'm also, as you said, I'm involved in Cosmonaut and the Marxist Unity Group. But
yeah.
But yeah, I also enjoy reading sketchy far-right philosophers and discussing them.
Yeah, so today, we're taking a break from my word for word almost slog through for political theory, and we're not going as in depth today, but we are talking about a book that I think is actually maybe even more clarifying to what Alexander Dugin is up to.
Right. Actually, well, yeah, I was going to say, reading this, I was thinking, this is actually probably a better introduction to Dugin than the fourth political theory book is. At least as someone who is not very familiar with his work. But as far as like what I found more illuminating, I actually found this a bit more interesting and giving an idea of what Dugin's all about.
Well, I think that fourth political theory is like written for an external audience. It's written to win people over, whereas Putin versus Putin and like the foundations of geopolitics are written for people who are already on board.
Right.
And I guess this was written in 2012, so it is now well over a decade old. It is
it's before the Ukraine war begins at all in 2014, before Maidan, before the Donbass separatists and all that as well. Yeah, was very interesting.
I was actually thinking like this Putin. When we get to the 12 labors of Putin.
Yeah. No.
I was actually thinking that like he's actually done a couple of the labors that Dugin wanted him to do now.
Right.
And I think this was actually written during Medyevev's term as president when Putin was the prime minister.
Yeah, and he's very skeptical of Medvedev.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he kind of sees him as like a, potential Western, Westernizer to balance out what he sees as Putin's Eurasianism.
So I'm just going to point out something in the title. The title is pulled. Putin versus Putin is not it, but the subtitle, Vladimir Putin Viewed from the Right, that is pulled from Julius Evola. So the two books that I'm thinking about that have that same title is, what is it?
Fascism Viewed from the Right, yeah.
Right, and Hitlerism Viewed from the Right, or Nazism Viewed from the Right. There's two Evola critiques of Mussolini and Hitler that are read in right-wing circles, and this is one of this is in that tradition explicitly. If you're if you know the kind of esoteric far right, then you know that, and if you don't, you probably missed that in the title.
Right, yeah. Then that is the thing about Dugin. I think a lot of honestly, some of his modern supporters at this point are kind of trying to de-emphasize the reality of his origin in kind of these esoteric far-right circles of Soviet dissidents, basically.
Yeah, I mean, people don't. I remember when someone was like, "Well, Putin's, not Putin. Well, Dugin's an anti-fascist," and I'm like, "Okay, maybe in regards to Ukraine alone, sometimes."
Yeah, I mean, I think he's anti-Nazi. I think genuinely, because I think you kind of have to be anti-Nazi if you're a Russian patriot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because Hitler wanted to kill all the Slavs.
Yeah, it doesn't make. I mean, and that's the thing is like, I feel like if you're the Russian Nazis are actually more likely to like probably be pro-West in a weird way, whereas like actual Russian patriots, I feel like you kind of have to hate the Nazis. You can be sympathetic to, I think the German right, which I think Dugin is. Like he talks about Arthur von Mahlerbrook and Spengler and Schmidt even in very positive ways, but in the end, I think you kind of have to hate Hitler and Nazism in the end if you're going to be like a Russian patriot.
Right. Although I do think he tries really, really hard to distance Schmidt from the Nazi Party in a way that's kind of dishonest.
Yeah.
But that doesn't actually show that much up in this book. This book, since it was clearly written for a Russian audience, I think it's a lot more direct about what Dugin believes than the other book that we're covering. And we can kind of, I mean, there is some stuff in here. The one thing I will say that for people who are not used to, if you don't know a lot about politics internal to, like, say, to Russia and the various factions within, like, Putin's party, etc., the first little bit of this is probably going to be pretty alienating you. You're going to get a long string of names that you probably know nothing about. And so I think that is probably why this book is not as well read on the right. And yet I do think we do have to kind of cover it. Because I like you think this makes what he's actually up to a little bit clearer.
Yeah. And one thing I thought was really funny was like how much he like kind of like emphasizes his success and influence in Russia.
Yeah,
like,
well, I mean,
he actually kind of says at one point that's like basically I've already won. It's just a matter of like my ideology being implemented over time. Like, he kind of like, because it's interesting. You see people kind of downplay how influential Dugin actually is. But Dugin himself is kind of just like, he kind of plays into this like idea that he's like secretly kind of like, behind the scenes pushing like politics in his direction in Russia.
Yeah, well, this is a thing. When I talk to both Russians and expatriates who lived in Russia, I get the Dugin doesn't matter. He's a laughingstock. I have revised that to think that might be somewhat true, but that Dugin's audience is not internal to Russia, that it's actually external to Russia, even though he's writing in Russian, because that, outreach is a big thing for him. He's been in dialogue with Greca, the European New Right group, for decades. And one of the interesting things that I've noticed about fourth political theory is that a lot of it's really like ideas that you get in Alain de Benoit and people like that. This seems to be more his stuff. This is what he believes.
Yeah.
But he's a remarkably difficult man to pin down. I mean, like, one thing I will say about this maddening about Dugin is every time I listen to an interview with him, he changes his beliefs based on who he's talking to.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's I was gonna say in fourth political theory, it's almost written for like a Western like kind of leftist theory cell audience in a way. I think,
right?
Like, I could, because it's, compared to this book, it's more you could say, like, for example, I was thinking in fourth political theory, his writings, the stuff on gender is a bit more like, acceptable, I think, to like a Western leftist, whereas in this book he's just like talks about like sexual minorities in very demeaning ways and kind of like says what he really thinks, which is like this kind of typical line that like LGBT and sexual minorities are kind of like the ultimate like battering ram for liberals project to destroy humanity. And whereas like in he hears some of that in fourth political theory, I think, but it's kind of like softened with like this almost like queer theory sounding like talk about like how we're all genderless angels or whatever or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it is interesting how different this is. I actually was kind of thinking, like, why did they translate this?
Yeah, well, it's translated by Arktos Press, which is a far right publishing house that kind of just tries to translate European New Right literature and classics of the European far right for an English speaking audience.
But that isn't that most of Dugin's books? I mean, that's true for fourth political.
Yeah. So I think this is basically Dugin's fans trying to make more of his work like available to more far rightists in the English speaking world, basically. I think.
Right. So if you were, if I was like dealing with, I don't know, Shabob Dugin. And he wouldn't give me this book first. He'd give me Fourth Political Theory, then maybe Origins of Geopolitics. And then if they won me over, this is a book they give me. Right? Like,
yeah.
There's
another one that's kind of like his Eurasian mission. I think I haven't read that one, but and there's also he has another one that it was kind of supposed to be like a popularization for Americans called like the New Great Awakening or something like that.
Right.
Which was kind of a play off Alex Jones as well. I think he was like definitely kind of like trying to appeal to the Alex Jones audience.
Well, it's one of the interesting things. Dugin has made so many forays into the Alex Jones and Tucker Carlson world, as well as explicitly to the left. I mean, he's been courting people like Caleb Marpin since probably 2013, if not earlier. And I don't feel like it's, I've been somewhat cagey about that accusation in the past, but I feel like it's like come out now. It's not deniable that Maupin and Haas and a lot of those people have met Dugin at this point.
I mean, I think it's like there's definitely become a kind of tendency within Marxism Leninism to see Dugin as a legitimate intellectual that is actually compatible with Marxism Leninism. Like, that's kind of the line of the
wild to me.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's philosophically it's like so far removed from Marxism in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk. I guess one of the things that I should say is we're also going to talk about an essay by Haas called "The Rise of Magga Communism" and its relationships to this book and Fourth Political Theory.
Right. Because we were both talking about this earlier, and we were both like, this is so MAGA communist. Like, there's so much of the MAGA communism tropes that like have been kind of memed into existence, by the infrared crowd. And now increasingly the Midwestern Marx crowd are like, this is straight Duginism.
Well, it's interesting who this was aimed to court, because one thing I will say in the beginning of the aught teens, I had this weird infiltration of one of my Facebook groups by this group called American Revolt, which was a Duginist rebranding of American Third Position. They were literally ex-neo-Nazis who were pro the DPRK. They really like Yaki. Like, so there was this like explicit national Bolshevism.
Yeah.
And they seem to have moved away from that. But I mean, and if you call MAGA communist national Bolsheviks, they're like, oh, you're just doing the liberal thing where the only eternal political position is fascism, but then you're like, yeah, but aren't you though?
Well, yeah, it's like some of the defenses, like some of the people have attempted to make more intelligent defenses of MAGA communism as a slogan, and not this. I actually do think like Haas does actually have more of a coherent argument in this. I disagree with it completely, but there is something there to engage with intellectually. But some of the other people defending the use of the MAGA communism, I kind of said, it's a more of a kind of a almost postmodern gesture to kind of disrupt like typical political thinking. It's a provocation. It's like, well, that's essentially what original like Leninov national Bolshevism was, not the Ernst Nietzsche German national Bolshevism, but like Leninov's whole idea of like taking the hammer and sickle but putting it on like a swastika style flag was essentially just like a provocation to disrupt the way he looked at it was there's this political spectrum and liberalism is like taking over, and it's a matter of no longer left or right but with the system or against the system, and we're making this kind of provocation, this combination of like nationalism and Bolshevism to like create the ultimate outside to a totalitarian liberalism, and this is a provocation to disrupt this false political spectrum that's being imposed on us.
Yeah, I mean, and the way it reminds me of Yaki's Fascist International I've been really thinking about this bizarre group that I remembered now from the early aughts called the National Socialist it was either the Libertarian National Socialist Green Party or the National Socialist Libertarian Green Party, which was another one of these like insane provocation group.
That's
like,
hilarious.
It was like, oh, we're beyond left and right, and we're gonna take that as far as we can. It's just like, and I'm like, oh, okay,
Right?
like,
Yeah.
I mean, it was a lot cruder than this.
Yes. Yes.
But I do think it's interesting. But let's get into the book. I think we have to kind of focus on a little bit of the 12 labors of Putin, and we can go from there. And we'll go back to Magga communism's relationship.
Right. So yeah, let's get into the Dugin itself. So
yeah. So labor number 1. Okay. Even from the outset of his first term, Putin accomplished labors worthy of Hercules. Very concrete feats. But I do love Dugin's penchant for like almost absurdist levels of hyperbole. Like,
right. It's hilarious.
I mean, this book was actually, unlike For Political Theory, which is kind of a slog, this book is actually kind of fun to read because sometimes it's both deliberately and accidentally funny.
No, there were multiple parts of this book where I just cracked up. I can't. I honestly I just find Dugin to be a very funny person. I know I might. This is probably gonna get in trouble for saying this, but like I just find him to be an incredibly funny person in a way that it's kind of like Zizek as well. I think I don't really like Zizek's politics, obviously, but I think he's just an incredibly funny person. I like listening to him talk sometimes.
Zizek is one of these figures that I also like I enjoy listening to. I enjoy making fun of. I actually don't know that he even understands politics.
Yeah.
Because somehow it always feels like the status quo is what he's defending, but in the weirdest way fucking possible. But nonetheless, anyway, so we have these 12 labors. Labor number 1, he prevented the disintegration of Russia in the Caucasus, built a bulwark against the Wahhabi invasion of Dagestan, and repossessed 2/3 of Chechnya.
Yes, I'm gonna say this is a big emphasis in his book as well, is how he really sees this threat of separatism in Chechnya as like an existential moment for Russia, and kind of why he sees Putin as like this why one of the reasons he likes Putin so much is how he reacted to it and how he cracked down on any kind of ethnic separatism and discipline the national republics. And he's very he wants to get rid of any kind of national republics, and he'll say we got to get rid of these national republics, and we can have some kind of reparations and ethnic autonomy of some kind, whatever, but regardless we need to centralize everyone as much as possible. He really likes the centralizing aspects of Putin.
So I think that was really interesting. I mean, it's been a long time since I've thought about Chechnya and Dagestan until recently. Dagestan coming back up because of mixed martial arts, but it is interesting how they were very worried about Saudi incursions into Dagestan. It is also interesting because it reminds me of there's an interesting relationship of Eurasianism with Islamism, because they're okay with some Islamist groups and not others. And that's
they don't like the Salafism. They don't like they like the Islamist groups that
they like Shia a lot.
Yeah, like the ones that are aligned with Iran, and they're okay with Hamas because of they're kind of part of this anti-globalist alliance. But
well, because also not to get too into Muslim world details, but Wahhabi Salafism and Al-Qud Salafism are very, very different. So and they kind of compete in Egypt, and probably I don't know much about it competing in Palestine, but I suspect they probably do. So there's that. Okay, so labor number 2, he cracked down on the parochialism fostered by the previous regime. I think he's here referring to Yeltsin. At first I was like, is he referring to the Soviet Union? But no. In its one Swiss movie, cut the Federation Council down to size. It went from being a body of dissent to a quietly obedient organization. He boxed the ears of the governors and booed the brash national separatists in the republics. I do think this book reminded me of how federalized the Russian Federation is. I think we forget that because we focus on like Putin's power, but like there's a lot of internal republic and also like oblast power in the Russian Federation. Like I think people don't know that.
But at the same time, Dugin, like, he wants to crack down on that as much as possible,
Absolutely.
Basically. Like he wants as centralized as possible unitary executive that, like in the next one, Labor number 3, he introduces federal districts to a military. He ties the administrative territorial structure of the Russian Federation to a military scheme, which gave ample, albeit nominal, powers to civil servants who are not elected but appointed by Moscow, who are responsible first and foremost for national security. So, he's basically like praising him for kind of establishing a more like military chain of command style around.
Yeah. A military administrative state as opposed to the American Civil Service Administration is basically what he's praising.
Yeah.
When I was going through these, I was like, okay, let's remove the content of what Putin believes and just think about the structure. How would I feel about this if we did this in America? I'm like, I don't know about that one.
No. I mean, I think this kind of centralization is probably not good. I don't think I would be for this.
He exiled 2 of the most notorious oligarchs from Russia. I didn't know who he was talking about here. Did you know who?
Baranovs. How do you say his name?
Baranovsky or no?
I feel like I should have done the research to be able to.
Well, this one was hard because I feel like if I did all the research on this, I needed to learn fucking Russian. So like,
I think it was Berezovsky might have been who he's thinking. I might be butchering that name as well, but
okay.
But yeah, that's the classic. Putin clamps down on the oligarchy. He doesn't get rid of the oligarchy, but he disciplines it to him.
He disciplines it. Yeah. So the oligarchs, there's still plenty of oligarchs in Russia, but unlike in other post-Soviet spaces, they know that there's limits.
Yeah, and they know there's a top dog that they have to answer to.
Right. Labor number 5, he gave a green light to the process of the Commonwealth of Independent States, proclaimed the creation of a European economic community supported by the Eurasian idea in his Tasha speech, and the common economic space, including the RF, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. That right there, the Ukraine part of that's going to become a problem. That is the basis of what, from Euromaidan forward, which leads to, the situation we're in today.
Yeah.
Because Ukraine didn't ever completely sign on to that, ultimately. And then labor number 6, he included the concept of the multipolar world in his national security policy for the Russian Federation, which practically means that Eurasianism has become legally recognized as the primary international strategy of Russia. Now that's interesting. One, the multipolarity is not a concept that is inherent to Eurasianism. It's actually a concept from, as I pointed out, it's actually from British and American political realism from Hans Morgenthau and E.H. Carr.
Yeah, Morgenthau. Yeah.
Right. And it was that a multipolar world would be more stable than a bipolar world. And what that was about was trying to peel off either Russia or China from each other in detente and getting one of them to cooperate more with the West to break the other. Right. Like that was the strategy there. And I do find it interesting that that's just not talked about, like at all. Like,
I think with Dugin he is basically looking to he creates this whole theory of multipolarity is essentially about this idea that world history is defined by land powers versus sea powers.
Yeah, the thalaccracy versus whatever. I always remember what weird.
And that essentially like the sea powers, because they kind of have to like spread out and expand. They have like this.
They have an imperialistic tendency,
to take over other countries, whereas land powers are more rooted in the soil and the people, and are based in like integrating cultures into their like civilizational space.
I mean, there is a Marxist version of this. Bordiga actually talks about it when he talks about aircraft carrier imperialism, where he
there is something to this. I think it's not entirely fantastical. I think you can incorporate geographical differences into historical materialism, but Dugin kind of takes it to the point where this is like the primary contradiction. That's just, to use Mao speak, I guess, where because the end of the Soviet Union doesn't end Western hostility to Russia. He argues that there's something deeper than the kind of the conflict between capitalism and socialism or whatever. And it's really this conflict in the deep history of land powers versus sea powers. And because, the US and the UK is kind of this Atlantic nexus of power, there's always going to be this contradiction between Russia, which is a land civilization, and these sea powers, basically.
Bordiga argued. I mean, when Bordiga argued, he argued the opposite. That basically, like, the sea powers have, because of the nature of capital, the sea powers have an advantage. Period. Like, because they control trade.
Right. Exactly.
And like blue war, I would say what makes it. I was talking to someone, and I was like, what the problem with all this is, though, is the Vietnam War hadn't happened yet, and that kind of complicates this thesis kind of a lot. But
yeah,
nonetheless,
and also today the whole situation with Yemen. We aren't able to actually enforce our shipping lanes against a land-based insurgency.
Yeah. Oh no. I mean, what good is enforcing shipping lanes against an insurgency that? I mean, there's other reasons for that. The other thing is, like, our logistic trains are too expensive, and they don't need that much. Like,
right.
It is one of these things where, like, well, if you have to have a ton of resources to run your carriers, and you've wasted money on shallow water boats that are useless, that's another fun thing that UNAS has done. That it really does become a problem, because this isn't going to help you, and it's another thing. The Russia-Ukraine war. Whereas, like, as soon as Russia gave up on trying to do the swift, get in aircraft carrier thing, and went back to just good old fashioned Clausewellian artillery, it actually started taking territory, but because these war methods they're four different things. And I do think, like, this eternal battle issue, I mean, it does sort of been like, well, if you need to take land, Clausewitz is probably your guy. If you need to, like, maintain blue water shipping lanes, I don't know, do the ODA loop or something. But like, these are different warfare strategies, and they have different needs and different costs. But one of the things about the United States that I'll just say that is a real problem right now on the war front is that we do everything for profit, even war. So that means that it's all more expensive because there's way more middlemen involved. Like, instead of just like, okay, we're going to pay people to directly produce it, we're like paying people to pay people to pay people to pay people to pay people to, like, move it around in this weird neoliberal way. And frankly, I've been a little bit shocked that the military allowed it to get this bad. Like,
yeah. So there's got to be people in the military who probably are, like, upset about this as well, and probably like, oh, this is not, the best way. Things. But
I sort of wonder. Anyway, this is off topic. But every now and then I'm like, when are we going to get our military coup in the United States? We're like one of the only New World countries that hasn't had one. So, like,
if Trump wins the election, maybe that will happen.
I have thought about it as a possibility.
Yeah.
It depends on if they really mean everything in Project 2025 or not.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to this. So we get these 6. I love that he said he completed 12, and then when you actually read it, no, there's 6 unaccomplished labors. I'm like, dude, okay. So he did 6 heroic labors, and then
his 7th is that he hasn't fully completed the 6th.
And labor number unaccomplished labors of the rest of the 12, he didn't fully complete the first 6 points.
Yeah.
Okay. He has not finally made up his mind concerning relations to the United States. Don't forget that Dugin and the Foundations of Geopolitics actually wants a nuclear war between the United States and Russia, which I think is insane, even from his perspective. But labor number 6, he has not understood the dead-end nature of using radical liberal paradigm in economics. Ironically, the American sanctions seem to have fixed that.
Yeah, I mean, 2 and 3, I think I feel like Putin has made up his mind about the U.S. at this point. And,
yeah, I mean, I think it was a still open question in the first half of the Obama administration. I also think, the radical liberal paradigm in economics no longer true. Although, as I've said to some people who've talked to me about decoupling, I'm like, the interesting thing about that is that's actually been forced on the U.S. onto these places. It wasn't them pulling out; it was us making them. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. But it has not. It has had a cost to the Russian economy, but it's also strengthened other parts of the Russian. They've had to do things for domestic production that I've criticized, for example, that during the entire period of the Russian Federation until literally the sanctions were introduced, there has not been a major focus on domestic consumer production in Russia. And that goes all the way back to Brezhnev. And that's just not the case anymore because they have to.
Right. Yeah.
So
Dugin is not a fan of liberal economics at all. Like he says, he actually kind of prefers socialism, at least in his idea of socialism. But he doesn't like that Putin is, he constantly talks about how Putin is like combining patriotism and liberalism, and he kind of concedes that, well, for a while this is like a necessary combination, but it's going to come up against its limits. And Putin is going to have to either go with the globalist or embrace an anti-liberal economic agenda, which
I would still say you've kind of had because of the sanctions, but he really hasn't actually embraced a totally anti-liberal economic agenda. It's more like military Keynesianism plus increased focus on domestic production because they no longer have access to as many foreign markets. Which can be good. I mean, okay. This is one thing I'll say about Dugin that's really interesting, that's really frustrating to me. He doesn't like liberal economics at all, but he doesn't have another economic theory that really makes sense to replace it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Even his.
But that's common with far right thinkers in general. I mean.
Yeah,
for them, it's the economics. Economics are a kind of just a secondary. The whole idea is to subsume economics to the nation, to the dictates of the nation or whatever. So it's kind of it's they don't understand the economic system as the basis upon which everything else in society kind of comes together. For them, it's a matter of making economics submit to the kind of medical physical principles that they want the state to embody.
Right.
And so it's more about okay, so if liberal economics actually is what the kind of community of the Vulgar or whatever wants and fulfills a national mission, and that's what we should have. If it's not, then we'll do more collectivist economics.
Right. It was it's interesting because in the early 20th century you could talk about a political economy of fascism and a political economy of Nazism, and political economy and Nazism moves from Shaktism, which is kind of proto Keynesian, to just fucking open markets, and get unions, and but we just tell the corporations what to do, but it's an open market otherwise. Whereas fascism proper, and Italy's goal was like, we're going to subsume everything to the state, but we're going to have these national syndicates. And I mean, weirdly, even like the collective bargaining system that the communists used in the Italian Republic period after the fascists was actually set up by the fascists. Very weird economic, but it's interesting to think about, because basically because of because of World War II, the far right's just gone, we're not going to deal with the economic stuff. We're just going to leave it out of the question.
Right.
Which I guess Marxists have always been like, well, that gives us an advantage in fighting you, doesn't it? Because we actually have economic theories, as do liberals, and you kind of don't.
Yeah.
I guess you can steal ours, and that's a problem, but...
Right. I mean, the thing is, they do steal from Marxism a lot of the descriptive aspects of capitalism. I mean, when Dugin talks about liberal market economics, he talks about he kind of describes it as like leading to the breakdown of all collectivity, of all identity, and that's kind of his critique of liberalism. It's not the Marxist critique at all, which is primarily, I mean, it is about, the infeasibility of the capitalist mode of production and its inherent tendencies towards anarchy and crisis and social breakdown.
Right.
But for Dugin, this is not, the real point of critiquing capitalism or liberalism. His critique is about how it replaces loyalty to any kind of identity of collectivity with, the profit motive and loyalty to money ultimately. And so for him, the problem with capitalism is ultimately that it makes people put kind of more instrumental goals over these kind of primordial civilizational values of identity, basically.
Yeah, and I think that
which is honestly what it's such a tired, we've heard it a million times from right-wing critics of capitalism.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is, it sounds like just aristocratic complaints about capitalism.
Right. It's a typical romantic critique of capitalism. And, I think you can also, the left also does sometimes fall for it,
Often. I mean, I wouldn't say sometimes. I would say it often falls for it, Donald.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, definitely. I think it's...
anyway, so I thought this was interesting. Labors 4 and 5 are interesting because I actually have critiqued this as being a problem in the Russian sphere of influence for a long time. I mean, my critique of Stalin, as you know, is a little bit different from Trotskyists or Westerners. One of the things is between the Yuzovchina and the war, whenever you complain about Khrushchev, but literally he's all you got left. Most of your good leadership is gone. I mean, unless you want to do Beria defense, which is to me I'm not going there. But this seems to be a tendency, and it's interesting that Dugin sees this because I was surprised. I'll just read it. Labor number 4, he has not implemented a rotation of political elite. The old political apparatus is still working according to the previous model, I guess the Soviet model, and his seemingly technical efficiency conceals its fundamental inadequacy.
I'm not talking about the Yeltsin model.
Yeah, this is where some of this is unclear. But I do think that he has not, that he isn't able to get a rotation of political elites in as an interesting idea.
Right. And that he goes into it more later, but he kind of talks about his whole idea of a prachina, I think is how you say it. It's a creation of this kind of hierarchical parallel elite that can kind of revitalize the elite as it kind of withers and decays.
Yeah, basically he wants a constant counter elite to come in through the decadent cycles of the elite, which isn't if you want elites at all, that actually is a real thing you have to deal with because it's going to happen.
Right, yeah, and for Dugin though, it's kind of he also says it's kind of almost mystical orders almost, or kind of the source of these counter elites or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, we also get into this weird part where he's basically a theocratic anarchist at one point. So we'll get there because it gets wild. All right, but I do think this is it. At number 6, he has not yet tackled an earnest strengthening of the Eurasian ideology as the basis for Worcest's place in the future of the world. And I was going to say that I was not convinced that Putin was a Eurasianist until 2021. And that's when his rhetoric went from being vague and talking about multipolarity, which of course, like Putin wants Russia to be recognized as a major power. Of course, he's going to argue about multipolarity. Like, that's obvious. Like,
the multipolarity rhetoric, I think, is very common in like semi-peripheral, states. Like, that's just kind of like what the rational interest of, a semi-peripheral bureaucracy is. We want we don't want one global power studying the game. We want kind of like multiple global powers kind of balancing each other. Like, that's kind of sensible, but that's not full-on Eurasianism. And
right.
And I think in 2021, I did, you do actually see Putin using more and more directly Eurasianist rhetoric in his speeches.
Yeah, I don't know that it comes from Dugin explicitly either, because the other thing is we don't have enough I don't feel like enough of these Russian political thinkers are translated into English for us to say. Like some of the more just like technocratic ones probably aren't. And one of the issues that I think we have with Dugin is there's also, in addition to the far right kind of wanting him to be more influential, there's also a bunch of liberals who wanted him to be more influential because he's scary.
Right.
And it's actually a problem. I remember when I was trying to, and also the degradation of Google is a problem, but I was trying to find these articles where I know that Dugin in 2014 endorsed Golden Dawn and some other European quasi or explicitly post-fascist groups, and I couldn't find it. Whenever I went to look for it, I just found Dugin, Putin's Rasputin. I'm like, oh, fucking get that shit out of the way. That's not useful for me. Like, it's not even those analyses are always like an inch deep. So it is funny how I actually think that has helped us not understand him. Like the liberal use of him as a boogeyman makes it harder to understand Dugin in a way that may help him.
Definitely. No, like I said in the book, I mean, honestly, he kind of leans into that,
Mm-hmm.
Like, he's like, I am the boogeyman. I am the Rasputin who wants to destroy the West, and I'm manipulating all these people around the world, and I am holding, And
then we have the Russian economic collapse, and I think we have to remember that. One of the things that's interesting is that I think Dugin's right about is after 9/11, Russian-American relations became ambiguous. They were during the George W. Bush administration. It was unclear how the United States felt about Russia. Because honestly, the United States saw the stuff going on in Chechnya and Dagestan as in its interest in the war on terror, which I think we forget.
There was definitely a period where we were trying to figure out how we could basically integrate Russia into the imperialist world system.
Well, it also seemed like the Bush administration might, do exactly that because George Kennan, back when our imperial overlords were more rational, wanted to bring Russia into NATO.
Yeah, right, exactly. That was on the table apparently at one point, but
right, as opposed to the Rand Corporation, which wanted to try to break Russia into several separate countries.
Right.
And neither one of those really won during the Clinton administration, which is it's just interesting to think about what was going on there. The other thing that I was interested in is he admits that there's both a right and left Eurasianism, and I was like, I did not know that.
Yeah, he talks about the Communist Party a lot, actually, and he sees them as kind of, taking up a left Eurasianist ideology, which I think is honestly probably true.
It's also interesting how much he like focuses on Zbigniew Brzezinski, who he knew and had met. So like, it's an interesting thing to think about.
Well, yeah, I mean, Brzezinski is kind of like he's in a way his arch nemesis, but also like a fellow, like a worthy enemy, I guess, because they both are these just very geopolitically focused thinkers who kind of think in terms of like grand civilizational like strategy.
What's interesting to me when I think about, we have a similar pairing now. I'm going to talk about the pair. So you have Zbigniew Brzezinski as kind of the left liberal end of empire, and you have Kissinger as the right end of empire. But on this issue, was much less hostile to Russia. And it's kind of similar today when you have someone like Peter Zion and John Mearsheimer on China, where Mearsheimer wants a direct war, and Peter Zion's like, no, we're just going to let it fall apart. And I was like, we need to mess with China, but we need to like not go to war. And I'm just like, that's it. I mean, it seems like a similar kind of debate. And I think a lot of leftists, because they don't follow very closely like the theories of political realism, like there's a lot of leftists, for example, because Mearsheimer said some decent things on Russia. In fact, I thought Mearsheimer was right on Russia until they invaded Ukraine. Forget that Mearsheimer does that because his larger vision is a war with China. He wants to
that's the thing about Mearsheimer is you really have to like realize that he is not like some lefty. He's not like, but he actually has been pretty good on Israel, which isn't,
he's been good in Israel the whole time because he sees Israel as a liability for the American empire.
Yeah.
Which, interestingly, I'm surprised more people don't. I'm sort of being like, this really is a U.S. imperial weak point, right? Like the fact that we seem to be doubling down on this even irrationally.
Propping up, the state in the Middle East that is seen by everyone in the Middle East as an occupying power imposed by imperialism. Doesn't help you make good alliances in those regions, I mean,
and particularly
but it leads to there is a logic to it, though. There is a logic to it.
Well, there's a military logic to it.
Yeah, and there's also, it basically gives us a way to kind of like force all of these countries to have governments that are like friendly with us. It gives us a way to kind of prop up all of these Arab dictatorships and have like Western friendly governments, because it's like, if you don't, do this, then Israel is going to fuck with you and you have to deal with Israel. So, there's a lot you could say that ends up enforcing U.S. interests, but it's also a weak point, Yeah,
it's a major weak point. I mean, because even for these moderate, fairly pro-Western regimes, it's like a major flashpoint in their own domestic politics. Like, there's no way around it.
Yeah.
In a region that, most Americans think, oh, it's like Sunni and Shia politics. I'm like, no, dude, you don't understand how complicated the competitions are between, like, say, Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and I've like tried to map who's aligned with who once. And I'm like, even I don't fucking get it. And I lived in Egypt for 2 years. It's just like, it's not even predictable by like religion, because both Qatar and Saudi Arabia, for example, they're both Sunni Salafist governments. Like, I don't know what you would think they get along. They do not.
It's definitely more complicated than that.
So, and similarly, like, was I've tried to tell people, like, Iran and Russia tend to be copacetic because Russia is afraid of a Sunni bloc and a neo-caliphate. They really are. That's one of the reasons they intervened in Syria. And they tend to favor like secular Baathists and that sort of thing. And I'm not to say that Baathism is good or bad. I think it's kind of not great, but probably better than. It's definitely better than what happened afterwards, but like,
Baathism's always confused me, because you end up with two Ba'athist countries that hate each other and end up fighting each other. Basically, it seems to me that the ideology kind of failed at least on its own standard of success, which is kind of a pan-Arab unity, which is itself a desirable goal in my opinion. But yes,
no, pan-Arabism. Well, I mean, ethnically copacetic blocks are probably not a bad way to organize the world. Like if if we had a world socialist republic, it wouldn't probably be the actual nations that existed. It'd be like, okay, well, there's cultural regions there.
Yeah.
Like, that's my personal way around a lot of these problems. But like, so Pan-Africanism to some degree, at least in blocks that makes sense. Pan-Arabism to some degree. There's going to be areas where it doesn't make sense, but nonetheless, I don't think, like in an ideal world where we won and there is a communist world, I don't think we totally get rid of all the civilizational cultures. I just don't think that.
No, not at all. Yeah, and that kind of gets to the Dugin's civilizational perspective here. Is he's not a nationalist.
No, I've tried to make that clear. He's a civilizationalist.
Yeah, exactly. He like constantly sees nationalists as just like, you guys are like going on and on about your nation's sovereignty. You only have sovereignty to the extent that you are united with a broader civilizational bloc. Like this whole idea of national sovereignty is a myth. Like it's a pure legal construct. Like in real power, real like sovereignty for him is kind of contained in these broader civilizational blocks. And also more importantly is each civilizational bloc is like so culturally unique and so kind of the path dependent on this kind of unique civilizational, cultural, almost primordial essence that they're all incommensurable with each other, Right.
Yeah. And that second part, was like where I'm like civilizational blocks kind of make sense because there's these long cultural arrays. We
talk about continental unity, for example, and in more orthodox Marxist circles,
right.
That we want pan-continental unity. We want to we want larger, societies that are integrated on a democratic basis. We don't want everyone carved up into tiny little ethnic fiefdoms. That itself isn't inherently reactionary.
Right. I don't know. You and I will one day talk about the fact that I kind of agree with Otto. I go between Luxemburg and Otto Bauer on what I think the answer to the national question is, depending on the day. But and I know you're more of a classic Leninist, but I do sort of think we just have to admit that okay, so North America, once you dealt with indigenous issues and repowered indigenous people, is basically it's a post-settler block you have to deal with, and then Europe, it's actually probably 2 or 3 blocks, even though it's not very big. And then Africa's probably 2 blocks, and there you go. But I mean, the one thing I will say is, outside of Europe, the imposition of European-style nationalism, which was imposed by Europe, is a problem. Because those maps were drawn just kind of.
Totally. I mean, it is a problem, but I think the problem is that the alternative that's kind of pushed forward is basically just smaller ethno states,
right?
Which is itself a European concept as well.
No, I don't know that we need Biafra and I always go to Nigeria because that's where this is really obvious, but okay, we have Kurdistan and Alawitistan and I don't know, Houthiistan and that's not ideal. And honestly, I think it led to the Soviets trying to do that. They hit pretty hard problems.
No, it was incredibly difficult what they tried to do with the national question. It wasn't perfect, but it was a decent try, I think. What you're trying to do is because the Orthodox Marxist position has always been larger multinational states are preferable to small states of single nationalities.
Absolutely.
Right. But nonetheless, this integration of states has to be on a democratic basis. It can't be done on the basis of one nation oppressing another nation. So for that reason, there is a national right to self-determination. Doesn't mean that we want separatism, but the idea is that if you want people to be able to integrate on a truly democratic basis, you can't tell people, oh, we welcome you as equals and we'll live with you as equals and you can have cultural autonomy and express your language, but don't you dare separate. That's not allowed.
Right.
Kind of the idea was the right to separation was a way to kind of facilitate merger into a single, ultimately, world culture.
Yeah, I think the problem for me ends up being the fact that to enable that there's this attempt to frankly synthetically build nations. I mean, Ukraine is one of them.
Right.
Which is not to say like, because when people go, oh, you're saying the Russian claim about Ukraine is correct. No, Ukraine is two different cultures, frankly. Like,
right,
Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine are very, very different. And should they be an independent state?
I honestly think, I actually think Lenin handled Ukraine probably the right way. Like, maybe the borders weren't right, because the reason the Donbass ended up being kind of incorporated into Ukraine was because it was a heavily proletarian area, and it was a way to kind of keep the Western Ukraine, which was more petty bourgeois and even like aristocratic and like nationalist in a more right-wing sense, under control. So there is a sense in which the way these borders are drawn up is actually, of course, political. But that's, this is nation building. But regardless, I do think there was a Ukrainian nation that had to be recognized in some way. And I think the issue is my issue with Rosa Luxemburg's critique of Lenin on national self-determination is she kind of just says, oh, these nations are fake. They're being artificially created. They're not real. But, and so, but what's the alternative? Make everyone speak Russian and try to eliminate any kind of national sentiment towards, in the example of Ukraine, existing as Ukrainian nation. That's just going to inflame that national sentiment and make it more reactionary and create a basis for counter-revolution.
We see that in the later Russification policies, in the Soviet Union. I mean, we really do. I mean, that's one of the... But I do think synthetic nation building also becomes a weird problem, because you start encouraging national
I mean, all nation building in a way is synthetic.
You're correct, although it does help if you you do usually need to have a printed language.
That is true. That is true.
I mean, there's a reason why I say the Cherokee Nation, it got so suppressed because it was one of the people that okay, we're gonna make a printed language and play by your rules, and that particularly in the situation U.S. could not have been allowed. But I mean, you and I have talked about this before. I mean, we're not going to settle this today. I do agree with you that one of the problems that you have with the Rosa Luxemburg thesis is basically we're just not going to answer the question of how we do administration with
so just
different languages.
It just ends up default being pro-Russification.
Right.
Which is her position on Ukraine is not that different from Putin's. A fake nation. It's really Russia. It's only a few people came up with this crazy idea that we're Ukrainians, and then Lenin for some reason is entertaining this nonsense and helping create this fake nation. And I agree that it's a very tricky process because you can end up creating more division by creating national units where they're not appropriate. And
right. I mean, well, you think about it in the United States, for example, if we were to divide it up into national units, I have no idea how we do that. There's so many intermixed peoples.
You would have to. It doesn't make sense. You'd have to create some kind of. The United States is a multinational republic already, basically.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is something that I also kind of hate about liberalism. Is I hate many things about liberalism, and I know that our Marxist liberal friends are going to be bothered by this, but is we have to pretend that somehow the United States is a nation state and not just a state. like because I'm like we're not one people. The whole nation, like whiteness exists so we can synthetically claim to be a nation state without being a nation state.
Right.
Like
yeah, no, it's that whole national question of the United States is so complicated because it's just is there an American nation, or is what women.
Yeah, I mean the one thing will have to be settled is surviving indigenous peoples' right of autonomy over portions of historical land. I think that is with reparations and the possibility of integration.
No, I agree with that, of course.
Yeah, I don't like to use the word land back because it means so many different things to different people.
Right. I mean, this is off topic, but the way I look at it is like, land back has been a slogan from, the indigenous movement for a long time. I mean,
absolutely.
You can look at, photos from like the late 1960s of AIM rallies where they have signs that say land back. And a lot of the Magga communists, the people attack land back as being a Bezos-funded psyop because there's, if you do look up land back, most of what you will find is this NGO, the NDN Collective, which is indeed funded by Bezos. But what's interesting is, and I know people who, have connections with, a lot of these communities. And, the NDN Collective is not popular amongst AIM. Nope. AIM will not work with NDN, actually. They will ban them from their events. So the idea that land back is like owned by one NGO is just nonsense. There's different groups claiming the fight for land back that have different, programs.
Different ideas, radically different ideas. Sometimes
right, it's just like it's to me a slogan is, it mean a lot of different things.
The promise and danger of slogans is the following. It's exactly, they can mean a lot of different things, and you can Mont and Bailey them in all kinds of different directions. Some people hear land back and they think either positively or negatively that it's literally, ethnically cleansing 97% of the U.S. population, which would be insane. Sometimes it means native autonomy over historical lands in ways it doesn't even involve anyone having to leave the land that they currently are on.
Yeah.
Like I've heard all kinds of explanations of what it means. And so it's a contested slogan.
It is a contested slogan. And I think it's you definitely get edgelords out there who kind of like play into the whole like whitey go back to Europe thing, which is obviously not a feasible political program. But I mean, I think talking to indigenous people on Twitter, for example, who defend land back, I won't just say, well, look at what we did in Standing Rock, trying to claim, protect our land from being like taken over by these pipeline developers. And, that's land back. That's what we mean when we talk about land back. Like, it just means like asserting sovereignty and control over like our lands that are, and I think really the way I look at it is like, there needs to be a process where these indigenous nations are recognized as sovereign nations, and the treaties are then kind of renegotiated as sovereign entities. Essentially, the way I look at it is essentially we have to get rid of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We have to get rid of this like nonsense idea that they already have sovereignty.
Because they can't even you can't fix a pothole on a reservation,
right? Exactly. But the thing is, they use
Congress,
because they use the existing idea of sovereignty as it exists in the existing system under the Bureau of Indian Affairs to actually undermine any possibility of economic development in these communities.
Absolutely. And
it's really twisted how it works, actually, the more you look into it.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things. Whenever I hear a lot of leftists, anti, but even some pro, I feel like you really need to learn more about indigenous issues before you talk about this.
Right, it's just you actually have to learn about the politics of these communities. And I'm not saying I'm an expert or anything, but
I'm definitely not. But I work a lot with
the little that I do know gives tells me that it's a lot of this online discourse is just removed from the reality of the situation.
Absolutely.
But that was sweet. But yeah, I mean the whole civilizational perspective is interesting in a lot of ways, because I think with the United States, like we were saying earlier, it's not really a nation state. but it's not really a historic civilization either.
No, I mean, no settler state is. I mean, that includes the Latin ones. So,
so I think there is something to this kind of looking at civilizations as entities in a political sense, but I also think it's
I mean, it causes problem. I mean, one of the things that I was thinking about, we were talking about land back, but we also talk about this context right here is, for example, Sun Yat-sen and early Mao both recognize like national autonomy for certain peoples, including like Tibetans, Western Muslim, Chinese speakers, etc. And various forms of imperialism made that hard to do, right? Like leveraging religious tensions in Tibet, or leveraging religious tensions in the Western provinces, leveraging ethnic tensions in Taiwan, which is in addition to the KMT hanging out there to this day. There's also both indigenous and Hakka issues in Taiwan. And early Mao, for example, thought that Taiwan was both a bastion of imperialism, but probably should have had some sort of sufficient regional autonomy, like say the Korean Autonomous Zone in like Xinjiang or something like that. And and most Westerners have no idea that like Chinese politics is that complicated.
Yeah.
But that our interventions in things like Tibet actually make things worse for Tibetans. And
I mean, it's the same with imperialism loves to weaponize minorities. That's
absolutely
ethnic minorities, but also sexual minorities. And this is always kind of the argument I make against like the people who are pro LGBT but also pro imperialism. Is that you're actually making like life harder for LGBT people in global South countries because you're making their identity be associated with imperialist subversion. So this whole idea of we need to do interventionism around the world to spread our values, that actually probably hurts people more than it helps them.
Absolutely.
And those minority groups.
Absolutely. I mean, because there are plenty of say queer Russians, queer Palestinians, pick any nationality you want to. The fact that is now associated with the West has given people like Dugin a leverage that they didn't have.
Right.
And it has been a political pressure, probably from people I don't know that Putin really cares that much.
No, I don't think Putin gives a shit about gay people or trans people, but he also realizes how useful homophobia is as a kind of cultural rallying point against Western values as this abstract thing.
Right. I mean, similarly, we didn't give a shit about about that until very recently either. I mean, people forget, but in most states in the United States, well, not most, but something like 20, it was homosexuality was illegal till the very late 90s. So during, I am 43 years old. For a little under half of my life, I know in my home state, they didn't actually prosecute people for this, but in Georgia, sodomy was illegal until 1999, I think.
Yeah.
So it's just something whenever we're oh, we care about this, our caring about this is pretty fucking recent. And it has been a thing that's hurt. I think it's hurt multiple times. But anyway, I do think this is something to see that it gives people like Dugin an advantage on this idea of consolidating this under a religious thing. And I do think people miss how religious Dugin is by the end of the aughts. I mean, in the 90s and early aughts, he was a weird esoteric, and he still kind of is a heretic. I'm just gonna point that out. But
in the 90s, he was doing weird Aleister Crowley cosplay stuff with
right. But now he's pretty much an Orthodox Christian, and that's a big part of his political identity. I think people miss.
Yeah, no, it's definitely there.
So, But we get to the second chapter. Oh boy, I mean, I love this part. There's some stuff in this that makes me feel like maybe this will be easier to fight than people think.
Yeah.
Because one of the things he talked about was, the economic and the bleak collapse, and his answer to, and this was, I think people forget that, like, this is during the oil shock, right after the recession, where in Saudi Arabia pumps up, and OPEC pumps a bunch of oil and lowers the price of oil in Russia. Russia thus has, its economy at the time was way heavily too invested in oil and energy exports. Similar problem in Venezuela, actually, and that opened them up for market class, whether or not you think it was intentional or not. And I go back and forth on whether or not I think it was. I've seen evidence both ways. It nonetheless happened. And what I find interesting is Dugin's answer to that is basically, well, I believe in the imminent absolute, and God's going to make sure we're going to be okay. I mean, I can literally read it. Like, in the context that I understand power by Byzantine standards as a kind of imminent absolute, anyway, power comes from God, and God does not always bring about good news. But ultimately, it's for the good of the Russian. I'm like, okay.
It's amazing.
And there is a way in which, like, this reminds me of, like, different kinds of dominionists, like, bending over backwards to justify Trump as a power for God. And I'll just get into this. Like, Putin is an ideal ruler for the current period. He's a tragic figure. He has horrible entourage made up of exhausted people, a sea of his despicable worms who are fouling up the entire field of his movement. But he is methodologically steady. I'm like, where have I heard that before?
Yeah, it's very similar to how a lot of MAGA people look at Trump. They're except, I was surprised that, like, I actually thought Dugin would be a little more critical of Putin.
Yeah, I thought the Putin versus Putin would be more versus.
Yeah, I thought it would be more 50-50, like, half Putin's good, half Putin's bad, but it's really more like 80-20 even, like maybe even more.
Yeah, even when Putin's bad, he's still probably good.
Yeah, exactly, because, like, God is on his side, and, it's trust the plan. Just trust there literally is, like, parts where it's just kind of just trust the plan. It's all unfolding according to plan. Eurasianism is descendant. I've already basically won the ideological battle. It's just a matter of, like, how long it takes to implement my ideas.
This book made me actually realize that his four ways with Alex Jones are actually more organic than maybe we think.
Yeah.
Because if you read, when you read, like, for political theory, there's so much that there's layering on layering of ideology. I mean, like, Dugin's not a dumb man. But, and I've said that, but, like, when you read this, you're like, no, he, like, when he's unvarnished, his unvarnished self is closer to the Alex Jones self than I thought. Like, he's really in the conservative revolution. We've already talked about, he can't like Nazis, both legally and also just logically. It doesn't make sense because they wanted to exterminate Slavs. So, like, you can't really be on the, but he does like a lot of German conservative revolution people. Like, there's a lot of Junger in here and a lot of I don't know, it's interesting.
Yeah, it reminds me of something that Haas said in one of his streams, actually, where he's talking about the kind of the conservative revolution and Heidegger, and he's like, one of the great tragedies of history is that, some of these people, like, if I either linked up with Hitler or kind of just fell into isolation instead of linking up with Stalin and saying that Stalin was actually the true, like, figure that would achieve what they wanted, which was this kind of resolution of modernity, I guess.
I think it's funny that Haas doesn't do that. Some of them did try that. Like, it didn't go well for them.
Yeah, no. Some of them did kind of try a kind of unity, and it's interesting because the MAGA communism essay, like, Haas from the very beginning is like, no, this is not a third position. This is not syncretism. this is, not like
No, it's actually he uses Bourdieu's talk about like invariance in the eternal.
right.
I mean what he does is he takes that invariance thing from like left communism, from that specific extremism of communism, and then ties it up with like a religious notion of like eternal civilization or something.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because he says, the left-right spectrum, as it's understood in the United States, is a false spectrum, but there still is a left and right spectrum, and I am on the left because the true left, not the fake left-right spectrum that's created as an abstraction by liberal modernity, but the true like political spectrum is really partisans versus what's the word he uses, like essentially like the kind of global the liberals, the leftists. It's interesting because we're against the leftists, but we are the true left, because the modern leftists are just the ruling class, the culmination of the ruling class having fully kind of universalized this fake political spectrum.
Yeah,
so
well,
he kind of tries to have it both ways, where he's like, we're going beyond the political spectrum and rejecting the political spectrum, but we're not red browns, we're not syncretists, we're not Nazbols, because we actually are true leftist.
Right, because the leftist is an idea that's beyond, which again, if you know left communist theory, that rhetoric is familiar to you, not on the counter communist side, but on the Bourdieu side.
Like, Haas is still his old left com days are never fully behind him.
Right.
It's like they'll never be fully behind me,
Or me, even. I mean, the fact that I even know all this theory as deeply as I do, and I will admit that I have very countless inclinations about how I think we should actually run things. But anyway, back to this ideological perspective. We're going to talk, those of you who stick around, we actually are going to talk about the relationship between Dugin and Haas explicitly at the end of the show. So, ideological perspective, the Eurasian. So I did not realize that he has this evolutionary theory of what Eurasianism is. That's not in the other books. At least not the ones I've read. And I've read a fair amount of Dugin at this point. Although I think the first time that I read a lot of this stuff, I wasn't reading it very closely. But nonetheless, what I find interesting, this is another thing where the difference between a Dugin book that's written for people outside Russia and a Dugin book for written as people inside Russia. Because a Dugin book for written as people outside Russia, he is way more pro-Islamist. But in this book, he's very clear that, okay, some types of Islamists are okay, but not if they're in our civilization. Yeah. Like, even though Dagestan and Chechnya have been Muslim for a pretty long time. He goes into the ideological evolution around Dagestan and Chechnya, talking about the Chechen Wahhabi specialist, and then what happened in Grozny, the reformation of the Russian Council, all that stuff. Okay. Then we get to Putin's ideology, which he does start with, some analysts call Putin a patriot, others call him a liberal. And I will admit that I've always thought that Putin's ideology is sort of shrewd reptile brain. And that's pretty much it. Because I'm like, I have no idea. Like, I don't know what ideological basis Putin is really arguing over, except that he thinks Russia should return to some kind of major power in the world. Like, that's pretty much it. Like, that's
I would describe him as a Eurasianist, I think, at this point, honestly. I do think Putin actually probably does believe to some degree in the Eurasianist ideology, in the sense of like belief of the Russian world. I think
right.
Kind of what.
Yeah, the Ruski Mir is like is very much a Putin thing, and that's Eurasianist. One thing that's interesting, we always talk about like one of the things that's interesting about tensions between countries who are allied is they often can't talk about it. Like, we don't talk about our tensions with Britain and America hardly ever.
Yeah.
And there's very little talk about the tensions between China and Russia. But Eurasianism would be a problem for Chinese strategic development.
That is
And
a good point. Yeah.
And so I've always like wondered, like, okay, so Eurasianism, what part of Asia is not part of that? Like, like, is it just, you know, what we can still now the contiguous, you know, Russian Federation, or it may be like, I don't know, the stands, or is it, you know, because it's one of these things. For example, another one, a place where you see this tension rise up is Eurasianism and, say, Turkey versus Odragonist neo-Ottomanism. Those are actually opposing ideologies, but like, given the political allegiances, they can't be brought up too heavily. But then Erdogan's in a really weird place because he's aligned both to Russia and to NATO. So like it's you know, it's these things get very fraught when you're like, okay, where do you think your civilization ends and begins?
Right.
And a lot of people think that what Dugin's on is like, oh, though they're pro multipolar and they're pro like national Bolshevism in Europe, so that you don't have a European solid bloc, so that you can conquer it. And I don't know. I don't. Having read this, I see hints at both that he's sincere and that this is cynical. And like, what's your take on that?
Well, you know, this is my whole problem with multipolarity theory, is that it kind of thinks that, you know, a common, you know, because, you know, you have the pre-World War I classic era of classic imperialism of competing European empires, competing,
which is a multipolar model. I mean, that's where the model.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that is what classical like theorists of multipolarity may like, the kind of, not the Duginists, but I think a lot of people would refer to that as the multipolar world. But it was really a matter of, if, you know, it was an Anglo-dominated world where you had other imperialist powers competing with England to carve up the world, essentially. And so
right.
You have a very it's multipolar in that sense. There's more than one like imperialist power that's contesting for domination, but it's still a world essentially divided in between, you know, the powerful European imperialist powers and this colonial and semi-colonial world that they're all in control of. And then, you know, post World War II, you have the creation of, you know, really, in my opinion, unipolar U.S. power begins after World War II, when U.S. takes over its hegemon status. Soviet Union is kind of, you know, it's the challenger to the U.S., but it never was really able to offer a total challenge that was, in a lot of ways, I still think it never actually became the superpower that a lot of people claimed it was. And so, but, you know, after the Soviet Union falls, then you have like the true unipolarity period, where the U.S., you know, tries to consolidate its status as a hegemon now that there is no longer any major challenger. And so the idea is, you know, today that, you know, we're going to see the end of the U.S. hegemony. So there's no longer to be a U.S. hegemon. Instead, we're going to have BRICS. We're going to have these other global polarities are going to rise. But it's not going to be a return to pre-World War I. Instead, these new global powers are not going to compete to carve up the world and to do imperialism. They're going to kind of create this new world order that's not imperialist, basically. And that's kind of like when I talk to people who are genuinely like pro multipolarity.
Yeah, they tell me
that's kind of what they argue for, is that it's wrong to say that multipolarity will be a return to imperialism. It will be a post, and that's kind of the argument, is that the telos, the way things are heading with China as a rising power and Russia's alliance with China, is they're kind of argue the telos is actually already towards a post-imperialist world order. And the way I've always understood it is that as long as you have global capitalism and nation states that are competing in this global capitalist market, those dynamics themselves will eventually produce imperialist competition.
At least in proxy wars, because you're going to need to get various states and other people's sphere of influence to give you goods, if nothing
right
more.
And so I guess, you know, this is one of the reasons why I can't like support Operation Z, because I don't see what Russia's doing as leading to this post-imperialist multipolar world where these different polarities are going to exist in a creative tension, but ultimately it's not going to be this violent like game for one to rise up on top and dominate everyone else. You know, I see it as essentially Russia trying to become an imperialist power. I don't think they're an imperialist power yet, but I think in a lot of ways what they are trying to do is kind of jumpstart to becoming an imperialist power. So I don't see Russia is that, you know, I don't see it as like them fighting against the, you know, the Nazis, the, you know, like I do think there are Nazis in Ukraine, obviously, and I don't support the Ukrainian government, but I don't see it as this noble mission to create a multipolar world. And I'm very skeptical of the multipolarity arguments, I think.
You and I, interestingly, I think have become closer to this over time, where I've become more more understanding of the Russian position, but still think it is fundamentally, it was a mistake.
Right, because it is fundamentally a ruling class project. This whole Mir thing is this fundamentally ruling class project that it comes up in contradiction to this current global system.
But it's solidified.
I don't want to undermine that, because I do think that there are aspects of multipolarity that I think are progressive, in the sense that it is opening up new possibilities for, you know, for politics globally. But I also think it offers up new possibilities for, you know, horrendous barbarism and destruction.
I also think it doesn't just hurt the West. I think it's hurt China. So
that's interesting.
One is decoupling plus Chinese internal problems has led to a massive slowdown in the Chinese economy. And I think that people used to argue me against this. I think it's objectively, like, no one's arguing to me that that's objectively not true now. The other thing that it has done is there are fracture points in the break of the Belt and Road Initiative, which I think was an attempt to do what the imperialists did with the Marshall Plan, without gunboat diplomacy and at a much larger scale, which would have at least complicated the U.S. Blue Water trade route.
Right.
I no longer, even though BRICS is a thing, I no longer see Belt and Road as nearly as viable as it once was.
Well, yeah, it's interesting how, you know, China, in a way, like, they're kind of operating under the assumption that there is a multipolar world and that they can actually do this kind of, like, you know, this civilizational collaboration without having an imperialist hegemon enforcing it, you know?
Right, yeah. And I think this is where you see people who advocate for the China end of the multipolarity and people who advocate for the Russia end of multipolarity sometimes agree and sometimes they're radically apart. And
yeah. And I think that's going to be one of the contradictions in Magga communism, I think, is when the contradiction between Russia and China becomes more apparent. And I think a lot of people don't see it now, but I think they will start. It will become more apparent.
Or I think the other contradiction that's obvious is obvious to a lot of people is the problem with BRICS is C and I don't get along.
Yeah, I mean, I do see constant jokes about that. It's like, oh, it's funny how India is the I in BRICS.
Right. It's just it's like, okay, so yeah, India has good relations with Russia, but needs good relations with the West, and it's trying to undermine China all the damn time. Yeah. So it's like, it's like, when people tell me, okay, well, that I have another vision of multipolarity, I'm like, okay, but then say that, because multipolarism by itself does not imply anything about the content of the various poles. Like, it just says there are multiple hegemonies, and the little powers are going to try to vie for, you know, I mean, another thing that's interesting in multipolarity theory that isn't talked about is that small states in your sphere of influence are going to want to try to move to the hegemon that's far away,
right? Because
they can't enforce their supply chain as easily, but they might give them good notions of trade, which is why there is so many proxy wars. The E.H. Carr Morgenthau thing was like, yeah, there's a lot of proxy wars, but proxy wars are not going to probably lead to a global nuclear conflict, so we're okay with that. That was their theory. Like, you know, that, and I think from the communist perspective, we do have to look at, like, how much the Sino-Soviet split really screwed, like, if you screwed things up, like, really, like, you and I are both on, like, the fact that we're just trying to play act that the Sino-Soviet split didn't like hurt both sides of that like really badly.
Yeah.
Bad enough that China made common cause with the West for a long time to develop the productive forces. They didn't try to do it the way the Soviet Union tried to do it before 1953, which is autarkically. Like they tried to do it on the world market, which made them subject to the American business cycle in a way that, say, you know, you and I have talked about this before, and when we talk about the Soviet Union, I'm like, yeah, it was an attempt at actually sister socialism, but I am a Hillel Technic theorist believer that it never really achieved a coherent model of what it was.
Yeah. No,
I don't know if you still believe that, but I think
I would agree with that. I don't think they actually were able to create a coherent mode of production.
Right, and but that the reason why I rejected state capitalist theory is there's no integration during at least not until the 60s into the world market. Right. And then they kind of integrate into the world market, but in a really bizarre way where they're taking loans, but they're not totally. It's
very half-hearted and
whereas after Deng, China fully integrates into the world market, including liberalizing things that like we did not liberalize that, like getting rid of rural education for rural women until it was reinstated by Hu Jintao or something. Like it was much more extreme than I think people realize. And I think this is something that actually is in the background here. The liberalism of between election cycles. What do you make of this part? You know,
hold on. It's
I have a different page numbers. It's in the ideology of Putin where he accuses, this is one of the things that's mildly critical, where he accuses Putin of being more liberal when he's not in an election cycle year.
I thought, that was, here it is, liberalism of the between election cycle. Yeah, as it says, his midterm was a kind of peak in liberalism, after which, as the elections draw near, his liberal pro-Western inclinations tend to give way to the patriotic side. Yeah, I think this is, like you said, this is probably where he seems like the most critical of Putin.
Right.
But, he says, in order to balance his strong position as a leader of the state, Putin has always striven to keep the pre-election balance in his political practice at 71% patriotism and 13% liberalism.
I do love when people just make up percentages.
Yeah, it's just like, what a random number. Like, it's in strict accordance with the Russian Public Opinion Research Center's results.
So it's not random. That's
so. I guess he's kind of saying that Putin is just like directly reflecting what the Russian people want in a way.
Yeah, that he is. This is the very like Robert Michel's argument from Mussolini. Like the executive can actually like in a Bonapartist way reflect the wants of the people and his weird ideological incoherencies. So I guess one of the things that I was reading...
But hold on. He goes on and says that there's a reverse situation where the state policy is 71% pro-West and 13% patriotism. So yeah, he's kind of saying that, Putin's patriotism is more rhetoric than actual practice. But at the same time, it all fits in the plan, basically.
Yeah, it's trust in the plan. I mean, it very much, even when you talk about like, you think about, for example, again, people don't tend to think about what the 2015 promises of Donald Trump was one of which was like to turn on Saudi Arabia and normalize relations with Iran.
Yeah,
which people just forgot that was like part of his agenda.
I forgot about that. Yeah,
because he dropped it immediately. um, uh, as soon as like Al-Sisi and Prince Salman and all them got together, like Trump just immediately gave it up. And also like he had to keep his own party involved. And I do sort of this is one question I was going to ask you, and I couldn't get this from the feeling from this book. How much of United Russia is just Putin, and how much of it actually does have like four different ideological cores? Because Dugin kind of implies that United Russia has Atlanticist right and Atlanticist left, Eurasianist right and Eurasianist left, and there's also the Communist Party, which is Eurasianist left. So, do we believe that's true? I mean, I actually have no idea, and like I feel like I know more about Russia than the average American, but not enough to say anything meaningful.
Well, I think it's just kind of like Dugin talks about this, but he also says, well, the society is just like depoliticized as well,
right? Which I think is true. Like that Russia seems largely kind of depoliticized until very recently,
right? But the politicization of, I don't know enough about what it's like in Russia today, but the politicization also still seems to kind of be like top down, like state-directed nationalism, just a little bit more intense than before.
Yeah, it's interesting. Every now and then I get weird insights from like, one of the things that I find interesting about America right now is like, we still don't the America doesn't really censor stuff very well. Like even when it tries to. So like if you really want to today, you can get on like say Russian TikTok or Russian Instagram. And like and I don't understand enough Russian, but from what I see on it, and maybe the pro-Z stuff is being censored, but it's like a lot of that material seems very apolitical. Like so it is interesting.
The thing is, Dubin kind of sees the depoliticization almost as positive. He doesn't really talk about it in a negative way, from what I read.
No, I don't think he sees it as. I mean, like I think he thinks that if things are going well, the population doesn't need to be involved in politics at all.
Right, yeah. Because he's not a Democrat. He talks about like an organic democracy, but really what that means is just the elites have an organic connection to the people that doesn't need to be like, recognized through democratic mechanisms. It's kind of similar to organic centralism, actually.
Yeah, it's both similar to organic centralism in Bordiga and also distributism in Catholic thought.
Right.
Those are two things that reminded me.
And it's interesting how Dugin talks about elites, because he talks about like how there's good elites that come from the body of the people, quite literally, almost like a biological sense. And then there's like the bad elites, which are foreign and are usually like actually from like a population that doesn't like come from the actual people.
Yeah, so I wonder how he feels about the Volga Germans.
Right.
Like it is interesting. So it's like, oh well, if you're from the folk, then great, and there's a meritocracy from you, but we can't borrow from outsiders.
Yeah, but at the same time, he does say like anyone can be a Russian if they like subscribe to the Eurasian ideology, basically.
Right. I mean, well, this is there's a strain of Evola and Spengler that is strong in Dugin that I think is missed because like, for example, when I was trying to explain the difference between like Evola racism and Nazi racism, Evola racism is like, oh yeah, Jews suck, but like Jews could become Italians. Like,
yeah, they just have to abandon their Jewish like spirit and embrace the Italian spirit.
Which, I think is interesting because it's weirdly liberal.
Yeah.
But it does seem like it's an older idea of ethnicity than the one that kind of dominates the West after Gobineau and America, like, biologicize our racial. Yeah. Which it very much reminds me of like some of the founding fathers who were like, well, of course these people are subhuman, but they could become like us, like if they just acted like us. Like,
right.
And I think on the far right in America, we saw a battle between the alt-right, which were racial nationalists in the old biological sense, Richard Spencer, and these cultural chauvinist people who are like, well, anyone can be an American.
Yeah, the Proud
like,
Boys.
Yeah, like
I was like, we're not racist, we're Western chauvinists.
Right. I mean, in some ways, MAGA communism is that too. I mean, like, it's like, so I mean, we're anti-American, but we're not anti-American. I mean, like, that's a whole different thing. But I see this as an interesting sort of. It throws American liberals who are very much used to there's liberal cosmopolitanism and there's biological racism, and that's really it. These older forms of ethnic identity really throw them for a loop. They don't know how to deal with it. Like, because they're like, wait, you're a cultural chauvinist and you even had to believe in some fascistic stuff, but you're not a biological racist? I don't know. Well, how do I feel about this? Like,
No, and Dugin, he's definitely, it's this kind of relativistic chauvinism where he's not necessarily saying that the Russian culture and the Eurasian culture is like the greatest and is better than everyone else, but it's more so that it's so unique and different from everyone else that it has to kind of like exist in its own separate space and it's incommensurable with other cultures. And so, it's
I that's interesting, but it runs directly in tension and contradiction with this whole land versus water peoples, because I guess he thinks that water peoples can't have a real culture ever.
And but that kind of also sees Donald Trump as like a positive development in the United States.
It is weird. Like, it's hard for me to see, like, so let's for example say that if the United States was to say, like, do something that I wouldn't even necessarily oppose. I'm gonna be quite honest. It's like somebody made detente with Russia at current borders and was just like, okay, we're gonna de-escalate tensions and try to normalize relations. Would I think that's bad? No.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'd love for that to happen.
Right, like, but would that change Dugin's stance towards the West?
Right, exactly, because his issue of the West is metaphysical, and he said straight up, it's always there's this basic like contradiction between the two that's always going to be there regardless of ideology, and so it's
like he because the other thing is, like, even this land versus sea thing is for him still a manifestation of a metaphysical battle.
Yeah, and so I guess Dugin for him there's always, I guess, going to be this kind of battle between the two as almost like a creative principle in world history, I guess.
Right. So it's it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting also. There's this theory that he does fly about how Putin functions, that he creates 5 departments of political will: the administration, the economic tycoons, the mediacrats, law enforcement, and the experts. So, like, I guess these are 5. He calls them departments of political will. I'm like, aren't these like state and aren't these kind of like the state, as in the state apparatus, not like as in the political state, but like in, like what we might call the administrative state. And then the economic tycoons, mediacrats, law enforcement, and the experts. Why is that? I'm not like, why is that unique?
Yeah, that's just,
I'm like, don't all bourgeois countries kind of work that way? I was kind of like there's the bourgeoisie who fund everything, who have the most power outside of the state, or probably more power than the state itself. There are the people in the media who are subordinate to that, and either subordinate to either major economic powers or the state, depending on the time of year. Law enforcement, which is what I guess is also part of the state, but does have a separate proviso than the administrative apparatus, even though they're both part of the executive. And experts, I'm not even quite sure what that means, but like, and I'm like, well, isn't that true everywhere? Like, those are like the major ways you administer political will. Like, it's just,
it's.
I was like, okay, so Putin does what everybody else does.
That I didn't find that very insightful.
The other thing is Putin as a gatherer of Russian lands and builder of Eurasia. This is where I'm like, how can you not say this is imperialist?
Right.
Like, because basically,
I mean, it's just irredentism, basically. Like,
right? Like, oh, we're gonna collect all the former parts of the Russian Empire. Like,
yeah, and yeah, it's he's very much openly like saying that that's what we need to do, and we need to do it. I think through like soft power at first, but then like I'm sure he's totally down with like doing it through hard power, like when they can.
Right. So we got the Putin's ideological risk. So one thing that we don't have to worry about anymore is liquidation into the Western system. That's not going to happen. There's no way that in no world now does NATO accept the Russian Federation. Like,
yeah, I mean, unless unless NATO somehow destroys Russia, balkanizes it, then reincorporates it as like they go with
honestly, it would be more likely.
I don't think will happen. I think that's going to fail.
It would be more likely, and I don't think this is very likely at all, but it would be more likely for like, I don't know, like the Republican administration to absolve NATO and just be like, okay, we're going to create a new strategic alliance and Russia's going to be a advisory partner in it or something. But
yeah,
I don't see that happening either. But like,
what happened when Tucker Carlson becomes president?
When Tucker Carlson becomes not even president, I think he'd have to be like dictator to make that.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
A lot of this book is repetitive.
It is repetitive. Yeah, yeah.
It's interesting because I'm like, okay, Dugin, what do you do? Because he keeps on saying that. I'll read it because you're right. An ideology that proclaims money and material welfare to the measure of all things destroys the morals and spiritual fabric of society. So we shouldn't have to worry about that. Therefore, Putin should adopt his liberalism. But that would even be like, I'm okay with that if like Russians can't eat. Like, I'm like, what do you mean? Like, because you do have to provide for your society for social reproduction to happen.
Right. That's That's always the issue with like, all these irrationalist right-wing philosophers is that they always forget the basic reality, which is that people have to eat, and that's what everything else comes out of. Everything else doesn't come out of like some ancient like spiritual tradition that everything's connected through. It's really comes down to like people have to eat and have shelter and survive as a species.
Yeah. So ultimately, just to skip ahead, Putin is great for the Russian idea because he holds up to the Russian idea, not to the Russian people as individuals or even as a collective, but to the Russian idea. And this is something about Putin's, not Putin's thought, Dugin's thought that I think people don't get how weird it is. He really does seem to believe that ideas have lives that are almost sentient. Like, I mean, he kind of says that in For Political Theory too. So the Russian idea has independence, freedom, integrity, and sovereignty, and thus Putin is doing a good job. And that, we need a night watchman state. And once you incorporate this enough, this is where he goes like more libertarian than like libertarians in America do. Where he's like, if you have this great leader and he incorporates the spiritual values of Russianness, and people don't kill each other because they've incorporated it. We don't need this Hobbesian state anymore.
Yeah.
We can go to the Night Watchman state, and from the Night Watchman state, we could just be like a spiritual theocracy and not need a leader at all. Like, I'm just like, okay. I get that from if you know your Bible, yes, that's like the biblical goal. You're like a king is a substitute because you didn't follow God enough. But like, spiritual anarchism is wild as part of the ultimate goal of this whole thing. Like,
yeah, no, but like we were saying earlier, though, Dugin's politics are very intimately connected to his religious views.
Absolutely.
And this is very much, he kind of sees Eurasianism as a fulfillment of this kind of Orthodox Christian messianism, I think.
but if he really does that, then I don't know how this doesn't go imperial, because like then he's got to make the Orthodox Church the universal church. I don't like, this has been an element of his thought and his like relationship with Alain de Benoit, who wrote on paganism. It's like, well, the problem with Christianity is it's universalizing. It's going to always try to take over the world. So like, we should be independent nation states with our own traditional religions and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, that I can get that, but like, I don't see how you recognize this messianic mission with this, like, well, but the Poles are okay because there's different civilizations, I guess, because God created them, except for the bad ones.
Well, that's the thing with the far right, is that they're always going to have this religious infighting, you know?
Yeah. I mean, well, this is the problem. Like, for example, one of the great debates in the European far right was like whether or not the European Union is good. And you're like, well, most far rightists hate the European Union. Not all of them, because some of them thought it created a unified whiteness in Europe. Like,
yeah.
Like, it's just like, it's bizarre. So, and then there's a section on Gramsci. Of course, there's a section on Gramsci. Because I want to write a book one day, and I have 3 other books that I'm actually writing, so this is not a book I'm probably going to ever write, but about like why right-wingers really love the liberal misunderstanding of Gramsci as like a plan for their own success. Yeah. And it's not just like Dugin. It's like, I hear people say Nina Power's not a right-winger, but I like Compact Magazine people are talking about like Gramsci and all this too. It's very funny.
Yeah, and I think like so much of Gramsci is just Lenin in different language as well.
Yeah, no, Gramsci is basically, we need to create a cult. Like Gramsci is trying to do the whole understand all the classes that Lenin told everybody to do, so that you can build the preconditions to build a party, right? And like cultural hegemony is about the preconditions to build a party. Togliatti used it to like justify what he did in the late 40s and 50s, but then God, when the liberal intellectuals got a hold of that myth, they really ran with it. So, and then the right wingers ran with that. I mean, because like Gramsci's like the cultural Marxist that all right wingers like, because he's not Jewish. So like, you could have that, and then he has like Tsarism as a way for transformation. That was wild. Although it's interesting, he gets it from Gramsci's Tsarism. And then the modern, I'm just going to talk about this. Charles Kapchin in his book No One's World presents a model which Gramsci calls Caesarism, which he divides into 3 types: the modern Russian corrupt autocracy, and the other similar models in the post-Soviet landscape, which appear to be dominated by corrupt groups. Chinese system of totalitarianism, which concentrates all power in a totalitarian manner on the governmental level. And I guess this is like not just like Maoist China. They think this is just how China works forever. And then the petro-monarchies of the Middle East, where religious or dynastic aspects of domination are included with very political structure. It's its own Caesarism, as well as examples of started sheiks. Let us stress one more time that Russia, according to this classification, belongs to a group of countries with Caesaristic rule. First, it is important that these societies' hegemony simultaneously enforce outside from the stance of the side of fully bourgeois government, and an internal opposition from which it otherwise tied to external factors. Hegemony from both outside and inside compels Caesarism to de-sovereigntize and to shift to a more globalist condition of hegemony. Neo-Gramscians in the international relations maintain Caesarism can be considered for sub-hegemony, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, he talks about Robert Cox, who's an interesting theorist. He's like this, he was kind of trying to make a Marxist theory of international relations, and it was working from Gramsci. And he makes a point that I think, and Dugin picks up this point, and I think it's kind of correct, which is that like if you want to create a counter-hegemony to like global liberal capitalism, you have to conceive of a counter hegemony that has the same scope and just which is a basic Marxist point, which is if you want to overcome global capitalism, you have to think internationally. You have to have an international scope of politics.
Right.
So,
and the way that they get at, which is what I find so interesting about MAGA communists, because I'm like, they don't have an international vision, really.
Well, they have multipolarity. They kind of, argue for the
but all multipolarity means is that there's multiple hegemonies. So I'm just like that. To me, yes, it's a vision, but it's a very, 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 very vague vision. Like,
yeah.
Like, I mean, because one of the things I'm always saying, like, okay, we can talk about multipolarity, but what kind do you want? You want one that's not, pre-World War I conditions. Fine. How? Like, what do you set that up? How do you get the parties to make peace? Particularly when, like, in this framework, there can be no peace between the sea world and the land world.
Yeah, no, I don't see more like a genuine kind of global system of cooperation on the basis of just kind of ruling class projects.
Yeah, you and I would say it would have to be on in some kind of international.
Yeah, it would have to be international socialism as the basis for a new world order. And it's, I guess the MAGA comms maybe think that this is all going to become international socialism somehow,
but they believe in hierarchy. Like, that's the thing. Like, Dugin believes in hierarchy. There's no way around that. And I sometimes I think MAGA comms do too. Like, I don't know what I like when I read their stuff. Maybe this is I'm not going to get into his stuff on the Bilderberger group because that's like standard conspiracy theory stuff. Actually, some of it's real. But the Trilateral Commission and stuff advocated for Russia with the RAND Corporation is what we talked about. Like, balkanize it. And the Balkan Wars, I think, is a real site of trauma for the Russian imagination, and rightly so.
Yeah.
And then at the end, we get Ernst Neckist actually brought up positively. We mentioned him.
Classic national Bolshevism.
Right, but why? But both as some of this is good, but it's never going to be good enough because the nation is not a big enough, counter political vision. Blah 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 blah. All right, there we go. I think. Is there anything else you want to talk about in this book? Because the last part's just a restatement of fourth political theory, and then the conclusion. He simply is the best, which is like for everything we might have criticized Putin on. He's still our God King. Thanks.
Yeah.
Good day. Like,
I think that kind of summarizes it. I think we covered the stuff that I took notes on.
All right.
As far as this book goes.
I mean, there's some other stuff about liberalism and nihilism, but
we kind of touched on his critique of liberalism and kind of it's I did mention how in his critique of liberalism, it's funny how like homosexuality is almost like the telos of liberalism.
Right.
Well, no, it's actually transhumanism is where
transhumanism and negationism are the two things that are really.
But he kind of sees LGBT as like the kind of ultimate like expression of that because it's casting away the kind of telos that's ordained by your biology and rejecting like that aspect of your identity and so he really doesn't like LGBT for that reason.
Yeah.
He has a very teleological view of like how humans are supposed to be. Everyone is kind of like, born a certain way and born into that role. And the liberalism wants us to, be individuals rather than the roles that were assigned by, the natural,
I mean,
typical right-wing stuff.
I mean, I do agree that it's personalism, but it's personalism frozen. It's, like, I do agree that like liberal individualism is actually, it is dialectical in the sense that it may have begun useful to break up certain bonds, but it also atomizes everything to the point of like, you don't recognize that you are a product of a bunch of relations and you're not just an innate person. And like, I get that. And I get that does complicate the way liberals talk about stuff like sexuality, because like for them it's all about an individual choice, and that's why we focus on either choice or like, oh, you're just biologically that way, and not like, well, social relations are changing, and so certain things are going to be
right,
different and more possible. Like, I really wish actually that communists would sit down and instead of like going one way or the other, accepting the liberal way of explaining this, are picking up like, well, people just are a certain way. We actually start talking about like, okay, relations change. Why would they change? What about the current situation would lead to that? Like,
right. Yeah, no, I would like to see more actual, historical materialist engagement with this stuff.
Yeah, historical materialist career theory would be nice. Someone do it.
Yeah.
I think who kind of tried. Was it Mike McNair who wrote a book on that?
In the 80s, yeah.
But he hasn't really picked it back up.
There's also the Emilio.
Yeah.
And there's I think but yeah, I think it's I think a lot of Marxists are too hard on individualism and individuality as a kind of positive thing. So I feel like we associate individuality with the bourgeois. It's like, well, yeah, that is true, but at the same time, like, I do think ontological individuals exist. I think Marx believed in ontological individuals. And I do think that Marx believed in individuals flourishing as individuals as a kind of end goal in communism. Right. It's just the only way to achieve the conditions for this are through collective action.
Yeah.
I am very weary of like critiques of liberalism that locate the problem of liberalism entirely with individualism, because it's often used in a way to force people back into the roles that are imposed on them.
Bingo, right. Whereas part of the I am one of these believers that part of the point of the project is to figure out like how these relations work so that we could have more control over them.
Right, exactly.
And that's kind of the goal, and that includes on social reproduction. And if you are touching social reproduction, you're touching sex and sexuality. Like there's no way around that. So let's talk about MAGA communists. I mean, we talked about them a lot already, but like, is they ain't actually Duginist?
No, I think their relationship with Dugin is very much out in the open. I mean, Haas and Jackson Hinkle went and did like an event with him. I think Hinkle did another event hosted by Dugin where Maria Zarakova
was there.
Was there, yeah, and she's a government minister, right? So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting.
That kind of answers our question: how much is this stuff actually interacting with real power? Oh, it kind of is actually interacting with real power.
I mean, this is where I was very confused about. So you and I both read The Rise of MAGA Communism, which is really sort of like the only singular statement of what this particular iteration of this theory was. I mean, there was the old patriotic socialist points or whatever, but like they don't believe that anymore.
Yeah, no, this is the thing. But if you talk about MAGA communism in a negative way, like they'll just spam you with read the Substack. You don't understand MAGA communism. Read the Substack.
Yeah, and I originally said like I've read everything you're referencing, so I don't know why neither. But okay, fine, I'll read it, and I did.
Yeah, no, I read it when it came out, and I reread it recently. And I don't think I've misunderstood MAGA communism. I think,
it very much, I mean, even to the point where like, no, he doesn't mention the Eurasianist part of this, but like the stuff about land powers versus sea powers is...
there's a part where he talks about land empires in a positive way. And he kind of talks about how...
the Mongols is his example, like as opposed to Russia. But yeah, it's like land powers versus sea powers and land powers in a positive way. He also talks a lot about real subjective conditions, not real objective conditions. But I was like, do people notice what he's doing there? Because he's like talking about these subjective conditions as having an existence outside of the mind. And that's
right. He talks about he counterposes real subjective conditions to people's ideas actually. And we would think, well, when we talk about subjectivity, we're talking about people's ideas. No, he's talking about something else.
Right. Yeah. It's like
ideas are just a minor little thing compared to what he's talking about with the subjective conditions.
So what I gathered from this is you and I have been kind of hinting at it. There's some Bordigism in this, and I actually think there's more Bordigism than there is traditional Marxist-Leninism, but you need Stalin because Stalin is more popular.
Yeah.
I'm like, because like, okay, when we think of like Stalin policies, and I say that I'm not talking about Stalinism, I'm not talking about Marxist-Leninism, I'm talking about specific policies, that are unique. What makes Stalin different from early third international Marxism, right? Like, okay, so the Popular Front, like that's not here. What else makes it different? Collective agriculture, which is also something Trotsky believed in, but that's not here. War communism, that's not here. What else? Big mustache man, good. Okay, that's here, but that's not the substance of what Stalin believed. But we do have things. Now, there is one bit of language from Marx where this is based off of. So it is, communism is not, an idea, but it's something the world has to accommodate itself to.
It's a real movement.
It's a real movement, right? But if you focus not on the movement, but the accommodation of something beyond an idea, it leads to this idea that you see in Bordiga of invariance. Like there's a program, it exists somewhere in the universe. I don't know. Marx found it. He didn't even invent it. The entire point of, the Bordiga's position is we're just going to wait until you can all get on board with the invariant program, because there needs to be absolute homogeneity, and there needs to be an organic relation between the party and the proletariat. But the party has no democratic relationship to the proletariat. It just emerges technocratically or organically. When you read it, it's like both. There's both this thing that kind of reads like integralism, like an integrated, and they talk about that in Borges' thought. And there's also this idea that there's the real left and there's the left of capital.
Yeah.
Now, and you and I have both been on the thing, like I was a left communist for a lot of my life, and I was like, even if I agree with some of these things, there's no Comintern, there's no second internet. I mean, there are internationals, they're not really. Like the Socialist International is a joke. There's no common form. There's nothing like that anymore. Like, so what would we be the left of communism? Like that makes communism an idea.
Right. Well, I think what you get with the Magga communism understanding is like there's the left wing of capital for left comms, and then for Magga communism, it's leftism. They just call it, which is also what left comms call it. And it's like,
right,
they call the open society, like the NGO,
right,
the Soros sites, the kind of
well, they seem to have blocked all the left in with liberals entirely, but not just like the obvious people that we would call rad libs and shit libs and whatever, but like no, like
but also like PSL, for example, PSL, like work,
any sectarian Marxist organization, actually,
which is honestly what left comms do as well, like there's the actual left of capital, like the kind of liberal, Democratic Party associated labor bureaucrats and all these kind of like reformist soft lib NGOs that actually do play a real role in administering capitalist society, versus like a bunch of like ML and Trotskyist groups that play no role whatsoever in administering capitalist society.
Right.
And there's plenty of critiques to have of them.
I mean, like I would not include all the weird sectarian orgs in the left of capital in the sense that they mean. Like, it's
right,
like, okay,
right, exactly. You
might say they're irrelevant, but they're not the same thing. Like,
but the thing is, when you push MAGA communists on this, it always comes down to the fact that they accept cultural positions that are associated with the left wing of capital, which always usually is like pro LGBT in the end. Or
it's like you don't have a problem with gay people, and you don't like using slurs.
Yeah,
Like,
and it
I
comes
mean,
down to this argument that they are crypto liberals because they don't oppose like
but if you took that,
LGBT, which connects to Dugin's whole idea about LGBT is kind of like this telos of liberalism, and that
but
it's
if
the
you
one
actually take that theory, then honestly, the Bolsheviks themselves would, until Stalin's war communist period, meet this criterion.
Well, they actually kind of say that. They'll say that, oh, well, the Bolsheviks, they had some, they were, they held all these ultra lefts this running around like preaching free love, but then Stalin came in and like reestablished like the proper Marxist Leninist. Like,
Do you know who Kerry Bolton was?
Oh yeah, he has that
Okay.
whole book about Stalin being like a
which is a bad book on Stalin, but like they
Yeah.
seem to believe that version of Stalin.
No, they literally will say like Stalin's actually a Christian, that he was actually Orthodox, which is just like a kind of an insult to Stalin because he was an atheist, and he would have been mad if anyone said anything otherwise, because that would have been an insult to Stalin, like, quite frankly.
Right, I was about to say, like, he studied to be an Orthodox priest and gave it up. Like,
yeah, no, he was an atheist. I don't buy this whole thing. Oh, he was
secretly a Christian the whole time, and he was really, like,
I was like, yeah, he was willing to make like amends with the Orthodox Church and bring it back in ways, but people forget he was harsher on them at first than Lenin was by far. Like, harshest anti-religious campaigns were under Stalin.
Yeah, that's when more people were shot. Like, like it's just, it's I mean, they just kind of use Stalin as a they use elements of Stalin to like project things on. I've always said, like, yeah, okay, sure. So there's this weird mixture of what we might call ultra leftism, right wing thought, and Marxist Leninism. But the Marxist Leninism is a vibe that kind of covers the whole thing. Like, and what's interesting about that is that's consistent with Dugin. In the second chapter of For Political Theory, he just says it outright. We only believe in Marxism as a Sorelian myth to get people pissed off at capital so we can do what we want.
Right, yeah.
Like, he says it explicitly. It's not veiled. Like, so I find this really interesting. Also, the impossibility of rightist politics. You and I together, way a long time ago, I think it was like 7 years ago now, back when a bunch of our former comrades didn't hate each other, and before Cosmonaut existed or Magga existed or any of that, we reread Demestra.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
And like, the impossibility of rightist politics in this essay is Demestra. Demestra's critique of conservative. I mean, he didn't talk about the right in this way. He talked about conservatives in the Yeltsin regime, but like, they're always losing. Their politics are impossible. By the time they recognize what they're, we need the right to be like, to utilize all this leftist terror and use it to terrorize them back, and like, and to quit being all conservative about the status quo. Like, so, and I found it interesting because, they use the same argument, but instead of conservatives, they put the right there. And I was interested. They do throw some stuff in about the manifesto and organic.
Right. Well, he makes the claim, because a lot of this is, his whole kind of argument kind of centers around this idea of, there's political modernity is pure difference and the production of pure difference. And, what we understand as the left in America, the political spectrum left, is essentially the abstraction of modernity itself from the real community of the people, right? And so, that's, this kind of Heideggerian point right there already, which is this kind of critique of modernity as abstraction. And so... But he also argues that, there is a real political spectrum. There is a real left, which is partisanship, which is opposition to the existing order. And the right can only kind of co-opt either the pre-modern, because the right is itself a product of modernity, because this is all, like, for him, like, everything is, a product of this split, this difference created by modernity. The right itself is modernity. It can only kind of appeal to the pre-modern in the name of shoring up the status quo, and it will do this, and so he kind of, like, to him, like, the right like the establishment kind of using conservative ideas and traditions to shore up the status quo is inevitably going to lead to like what he says, like BLM and LGBT will become like just as right wing as anything else, and you know.
Yeah, I mean, we see this today. I wanted to ask you. I don't know how you and I feel about the quote left. I know increasingly I believe in the political spectrum. I believe that attempts to prematurely transcend the left and right almost always go right, and I have my reasons for thinking that. And it's not just based off fascism; it's based off of like, well, to try to prematurely change, you know, a spectrum that emerges because of the way we organize society today, anyway. That you're going to always have to try to glom on to that prefiguration on something in the status quo or some prior ideal, and like that's going to lead to a kind of conservatizing element in your thought, and it's going to grow and grow and grow most likely as you push back against the left. And I also think it's interesting that these groups always identify the left, you know, the change, or leftists in this case, because there's the two lefts in this.
Yeah, there's leftists and the actual left.
Yeah, and you know, but the left in here is transhistorical for them. I mean, they talk about the problem of like the metaphysical, you know, spectrum of politics, but then interestingly, their answer to the metaphysical spectrum of politics is a more metaphysical politics. Like it's like, because he also talks about the eternal, like the partisan is fighting for the eternal. And I'm like, okay, what is that? Like, and I also just like find this like fascinating. This is almost completely devoid of political economy. Like, there's almost no political economy here.
Yeah, no, it's entirely kind of theories of sovereignty. It's very Schmittian. It's very much about sovereignty as a subject in itself.
But do you see what I'm saying about what he does with the right is identical to what like de Maistre was doing with conservatism and in the pieces we read by de Maistre?
Oh yeah, totally. He's basically he's criticizing the right on the same ground that de Maistre does.
The conservatives in the Auchan regime. I mean, like, and what do we make about the fact that he focused so much on the open society and Soros? Because yes, Soros does stuff. Yes, the open society idea. I don't even think most liberals accept the open society idea today. Like how many fucking liberals are really influenced by Karl Popper?
Yeah. Like, I mean, I'm not one of those people who thinks that like any kind of like discussion about Soros is like anti-Semitism, you know?
No. I mean, he does. He does front shit all the time. That's absolutely true.
Yeah, but I also just think like Soros is like not as important as people make him out to be.
I don't know. It's like the American government.
I mean, I just think that, you know, he's a powerful person. He does fund a lot of stuff. He's very you know, he's influenced in, you know, a lot of the anti-China protests apparently in Hong Kong. He was funding, but at the same time, you know, he also funds like anti-Zionist groups, weirdly enough.
Right.
And it also, you know, it's a lot of it's just very opaque. So we don't know how much of this funding is actually like how much does Soros himself decide where this funding goes versus people he just hires to kind of do this work. And, you know, I think it's one of those instances where I think it's because the reason he chooses the open society as kind of like the enemy is because he's trying to set up this whole kind of dialectic of there's the liberal open society, which is, you know, opening things up, and it's the global market, and then there's everything that's outside that, which is against the system, and everything that's kind of against openness and for like eternal metaphysical truth. Very Duginist. It's very
Duginist. It's very jihad versus Mac world too. Like
yeah, exactly. It's not a theory of class struggle
at all.
Like he will mention class struggle and saying this is all just a kind of refracted, like this conflict between globalist modernity and the partisan is just a kind of refracted like version of the class struggle. But it's so many layers removed from what, you know, we understand as class struggle in a political economic sense that it kind of becomes like to the point where now like farmers who actually own capital and higher waged labor are the proletariat because they're rebelling against the globalist order, which is, you know, the order of the bourgeoisie or whatever.
Right. Well, I mean, I do think we've seen this before. Like one of the things that we can both talk about a little bit is there's been a tendency in Marxist-Leninist traditions going back to the 70s to try to not define the new subject, but to just redefine what the proletariat is.
Right.
Like, I mean, Jay Sakai is the greatest example. Like the nations, and for Jay Sakai, nations are racial groups. And I actually was like, you know, I know that Jay Sakai was a Marxist-Leninist Maoist. I actually know that just for a fact. That the ideas that he was a CIA anarchist seem to
that's
be
not
completely
true.
made up. But
he was around the circles of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and, you know, that kind of stuff. That was kind of his milieu.
Right.
And the Sojourner Truth organization as well.
Right. So, I mean, you know, and these ideas come up. I mean, weirdly, they come up in other places. Like this comes up in this idea that you see in the Johnson Forrest tendency and the Marxist humanist tendency that what Marx meant by advanced when he said, you know, socialists should join with the advanced part of the proletariat was the marginalized. Like, so we see it, but it's a redefinition of, actually, in the case of Jay Sakai, it's a redefinition of what nation is and a redefinition of what proletariat is.
Well, I think with Sakai, it's interesting because I actually read Sakai as a class reductionist, and I think
I do too, and I think he's a class reductionist and a race reductionist simultaneously.
Right, he tries to do class reductionism by kind of collapsing race, class, and nation into one thing, which is
right.
Yeah, and that's actually my critique of Sakai is, you know, that he kind of actually tries to do class reductionism too hard and ends up like kind of muddying the categories. And
I mean, weirdly, I would actually agree with you, and I would go so far as to say, in a way, his error is a similar thing to the error I accuse Mark Fisher of, and those two people would hate each other.
Yeah,
like, but nonetheless, I have read Settlers word for word, and I think, you know, I would say, I actually would probably surprise people. I would say that I think it's like half good and half terrible.
It's not as insane as people act like it is. Like people act like it's.
No, well, particularly if you read his later work, like if you read When Race Burns Class, like it's not, he's not making as essentialist of claims as you think he's making in that.
Yeah, he's not. It's just the problem is like he doesn't really have any feasible vision of how a revolution could actually occur.
No, and he also, I will say, when you're right, he's a class reductionist, and he tries to reduce class, race, and nation into one thing. But that also means that, like, we don't know what a nation is other than, like, oppressed racial groups. Because, like, the idea, for example, that Chinese migrant, like, corvée labor in the West Coast was a nation is a weird idea. Like it's like, okay, why? Like, when you go back to the national question debates, none of the criteria that anyone comes up with would.
Yeah, I mean, there is also like a theory, like kind of in the new left, of like anything can be a nation. Like we're the Yippies, so the whole idea of like we're the youth nation. Like we're
right, yeah.
You know, anyone can band together and create a nation if they believe that they're one. So we're going to create the youth nation and revolt against the square boomer nation, or not obviously we are the boomer, right? Square, the square nation.
Yeah, I mean I think people underestimate the damage done to Marxist theory during the end of the New Left. Like,
oh yeah, but at the same time, I think a lot of it was people trying to like creatively apply Marxism to understand their conditions, and you know that leads to some embarrassing, like, you know, stuff.
Embarrassing.
Like,
and even
not every
dangerous.
experimental, you know, album your favorite artist makes is going to be great, but at least they're experimenting, you know.
Well, you and I know I sound very critical of the New Left. I'm one of these people who thinks the problems of the American left are way older than the New Left. So, like,
oh yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, way back.
Basically everything post Debs is problematic. And I actually think, and I'm going to also say this, I don't think the early CPUSA was that bad. So, like, you know, but it was. I was thinking, like, going back and reading some William Z. Foster stuff, and I was like, it's not particularly dialectical, weirdly. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But it does seem to me that a lot of the weirdness that we see in Haas is actually enabled by other weirdness that we've seen other places.
Oh yeah, I mean, in Haas, you know, he was kind of associated also with the accelerationist circles around Reza.
Reza Nagastani, yeah.
Yeah, that guy, yeah. I don't know much about him, but I know that he was kind of like around those kind of weird accelerationists adjacent circles. And
yeah, I mean, Reza Nagastani, I mean, who recently converted to Islam.
Yeah,
but yeah, there is, which weirdly also means that indirectly that Haas was in. I actually was about to say there's some rhetorical tricks that I recognize from Land and from Mark Fisher that I see here that seems like a CRRU accelerationist Delusian thing. So you know,
that's another thing about Haas is he's actually very open to a lot of the French theory in a way that the Midwestern Marx guys would never be, because they totally reject all that as like CIA, like psyop. Whereas Haas is like, no, let's read Derrida, let's read Deleuze, let's read Lacan, you know?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's going to be interesting where this all goes now that Midwestern Marx and MAGA communism are on the same side explicitly.
Yeah.
Literally the day, like the day before they announced that, I did an interview with like One Dime, and I was like, well, I consider Midwestern Marx, like, I think they're wrong and annoying on a lot of things, but I definitely consider them, Marxist on our side. And I don't feel that way about MAGA communist. And then they declared MAGA. It's like, shit.
Yeah. It's disappointing to see, because like I remember when the MAGA communism meme like first started like trending, like that guy Eddie made like a TikTok that was actually kind of a decent critique of it. It was like, yeah, I'm not against like reaching out to like conservative like Trump voters and trying to win them to communism, but I just can't get down with MAGA as a slogan, because if America used to be great, then why did our forefathers like John Brown and Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman have to fight so hard, and
right,
just like. And then Haas kind of has this defense of the slogan in the.
They also tried to tell me, his fans tried to tell me that MAGA is bigger than anything from the Republican Party, and I'm like, it's a Republican Party.
Right, exactly. Like the kind of argument is that like, well, what MAGA is doing is it's like introducing partisanship into a political system that's been like kind of domesticated by this globalist open society agenda, and MAGA, even though it like it's tainted by all the aspects of the old world, and it's right-wing coded according to the liberals. This is just because anything that like rises against the open society hegemony is going to be coded as fascist, because that's just the ideology of liberalism. And so MAGA represents a true like sense of partisanship that can allow something that actually is in opposition to this global order to develop finally in American politics. And so we have to understand that MAGA, in this sense, because it's partisan against globalist hegemony, is actually truly left-wing.
Right.
And this doesn't, there's no actual engagement with the actual, what is the MAGA movement? Because they keep saying it's not about Trump the person, it's about the MAGA movement, and Trump is just a mascot for it. He's just Ronald McDonald. We want the burger, is what they always say. And so it's like, so what is the actual substance of MAGA as a materially reproducing community? There's no investigation into that. Because I think if you do investigate it, you find out there really isn't much to it beyond a bunch of grifters and atomized individuals who give money to these grifters,
Right. Well, I mean, this is the problem that I have with this transhistorical partisan thing is like, okay, so there's just like this eternal thing that emerges that goes against the system, but like it doesn't exist in the system at all. It's not built into the economic and social reproductive mechanisms that everything else is. Like it seems both weirdly inhumanist, but not inhumanist enough. Like it's not really. There's a kind of metaphysical spectral pleading going on, and I mean, I think that's true for Dugin too. I think it's true for a lot of the kind of far right, in a way that like the quote normal right doesn't do. There have been times where I'm like, you know, guys, maybe you guys should read some Leo Strauss or some like more normal conservatives to figure out like where the stuff actually comes from, because, and I don't just think it's I think there's a lot of this Americanist stuff that, I mean, we can talk about, you know, you talk about Midwestern March, you talk about Magga Cosmonaut, but like you can even talk about like the milieu around where sublation is going. That just takes this stuff at face value, but doesn't take the left at face value. And I find that weird. Like, why would you take, okay, I get being critical of the left. Like, I you know, the left, whatever that is. Like, it's a broad milieu. Like, you and I are not each other. And we're also not like, I don't know, anarchist in Oakland. We're not people who take money from George Soros. You know, you're not even other caucuses in your same organization,
right? Exactly. And I'm not even everyone else in Mug, you know,
right. So like, which is not to say there isn't some continuity there, like there is, or we couldn't talk about a political spectrum, but like, why would you take any of this? If you're going to critique it, you need to critique the entire social system and then figure out our relationship to that and how maybe we can use that to our advantage to break it apart or not. And I feel like this is just not sufficient for that. And either the right-wing Duginist, fourth positionists, they're not going to claim to be right-wing, although, again, feels like right-wing thought that we've seen before.
Yeah.
Like,
it's right-wing as far as I'm concerned.
Like, there's a continuity of thought here.
Yeah, no, it's in the tradition of irrationalist right-wing thought.
Like I feel like that if Isaiah Berlin was still alive, there would be a chapter on Dugin, like, you know, like Herder, Dugin, like, but when we say irrationalist, we should not imply that we think this is stupid. This is one thing I think that a lot of leftists and liberals both underestimate. They're, oh, it's just a meme. Okay, that might be true. But it is a thought out meme that if you look at it, you do have to answer to it. And a lot of people a lot of people don't seem to want to engage it to even rebut it.
Yeah.
And I know that maybe that follows the logic of deplatforming, but can we just admit that doesn't work?
It doesn't work at all. They're just deplatforming, really. I mean, it might work at like actually getting certain people deplatformed, but it doesn't make the ideas go away.
No, I mean, like, okay, I'm gonna make a claim. I wonder what you make about this claim. The right is stronger as a cultural force in America after Trump left than it is during the Trump administration.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's definitely the case.
Right, like, so and the left is, I don't know if we're weaker, but like, we're more
definitely like, they're definitely like kind of in a weak spot right now.
Yeah, I mean,
a big part of why is because so much of the left basically thought that, oh well, we can kind of like be the people who push Biden to the left and not actually try to like form an opposition to the system, which basically means that like MAGA comes out looking like the only real opposition to the system, and so it creates a problem where the left and, you know, socially progressive cultural values also associated with the left become associated with the ruling class, basically, in a way.
Well, this is where Benjamin Studebaker kind of has a point, though. A lot of people in both these anti-systemic movements think that they're opposing something and they side with part of it because the other thing we could say, these people are tailing MAGA.
Yeah, they are tailing. They are, but like,
why join up with it? Like, why make it your like trans-historical object or whatever? Like,
yeah.
In a way that I will actually give Dugin. Dugin's not. Well, maybe they're tailing. I don't know. United Russia. I can't actually tell. I'd have to know a lot more about Russia to know that, but it doesn't feel like that's as true.
Well, the problem with MAGA communism is also the fact that like they're really trying to pivot to the anti-Zionism thing, but the actual MAGA movement, not just Trump, is a Zionist movement.
Right.
Like it's not like they'll cope and say, "Oh, the average MAGA is actually against Israel and is America first, not Israel first, and they want to stop giving money to foreign countries." But that's not true. Like, it's the rank and file MAGA guys will like rally with Israeli flags, in my town. It's not just like
No, I mean, like it's the far right that is not like
I mean, the only faction of MAGA that's not pro-Israel is Nick Fuentes and the Groypers, and
right.
that's just even like I think
that's just because they're Nazis. Like explicitly.
there were some like actually and they will actually admit this if you bring it up. There were some early attempts from the MAGA communists to form alliances with Nick Fuentes and the Groypers, but it was just impossible because they are Nazis, and it's not just like an edgy posture they do. They actually are Hitlerites.
Yeah, I mean they're Catholo National Socialists. Like a vaguely brown coated and Islamic background and probably practicing in some ways person is gonna have a hard time with that. Like
but if I don't know if you noticed, but they are actually getting like Muslims to come to their conferences and stuff. Like Fuentes got that guy Soleiman Ahmed and that Sneeko guy to speak at their big convention this weekend. So it's funny how they're trying to make these alliances, even though they hate these people. But it's like,
I mean,
so opportunistic.
What is interesting to me, like, where the opportunism goes, and I think we're going to see a lot of this. Like, we're talking about like some of the most extreme examples, but there are less extreme examples. Like, there's a whole lot of people who seem to think that maybe tailing Republicans is going to be a way to not be associated with a shitty and unpopular Democratic presidency. But in a way, and this is a broader left problem, one of the worst periods for Alex Jones' popularity was when he actually got on the Trump train and lost his counter-systemic force within the Republican Party. Now that they're not in power, he's actually not going to be around very long for legal reasons, but his popularity seemed to be more relevant again. I think that one of the dangers with just superficial counter-systemic things, when you're basing your counter-systemic on just who's in power of a faction at any given time, Benjamin Studebaker's right about this. You're just empowering one part of the state against another and one part of the faction of elite against another.
Right. Yeah. And that is what most dissident politics amounts to.
Right. And one of the things I kind of admire about Dugin is he admits it.
Yeah. He does admit it. Yeah.
Like, no, these other people don't. Like, it's a weird position to be in. And anything you like to say, Donald? Anything you like to plug? We'll go for 2.5 hours.
Well, I enjoyed talking about all this stuff. It was kind of it felt refreshing to just talk about all this insanity and just get it all out there, because also because there aren't a lot of people who like know about all of this stuff like we do, so we can kind of just really unpack everything.
Yeah, I'm kind of like the reverse Haas. I am a former reactionary who went through a normal left phase, a platypus phase, whatever that is, a leftcom phase, and have kind of ended up as like, I always say I'm either the right wing of the very far left or the left wing of the Marxist center. I have no idea where that would put me, but and I very much believe the political spectrum is relative. So that's why until we get out of capitalism, it's going to be relevant.
I would say I'm the center left of the left.
Right. Yeah. And I would be slightly left of you, but nonetheless, like the other thing that we share is we're big tent leftist. And I'm not saying that means that everybody gets to be involved. There's got to be a line, and and I do think MAGA communism's on the other side of the line.
No, I think if they start intervening in real world politics, we'll start seeing some very crazy stuff happening, and that will make it more apparent, I think. But
do you actually see them intervening in real world politics?
I don't know.
It's hard for me to know. Like,
they're starting to try to, because they now have their Institute for a Free America.
But isn't that going to go the way of the Center for Political Innovation? I mean, they don't want
to go that way. I know from because I do talk to some of these MAGA communist people. Like I'll admit to that. Like I'm not like.
I mean, I talk to conservatives, dude. Like, it's not.
Yeah, the thing is, like, I'll talk to anyone. Like, I don't feel like talking to someone is like showing all in complete agreement or anything, of course. So I will talk to them, and they will always like say, "Oh, the CPI is what we're not going to do." So what are you going to do then? What is it going to look like? And so I'm curious to see where this all goes and where this Midwest Marx alliance goes. I predict it's going to go nowhere good. Like Jackson Hinkle is kind of who they're all banking on for their success, because he's got 2 million followers on Twitter, and he's been on Tucker Carlson and Russian TV, and the Houthis watched one of his speeches, and he's everywhere, and he's a spokesperson for American communism. And if you make any criticism of Jackson Hinkle, they will always say this, but he's so popular. How can you not see the value in this? And it's like, well, you keep pointing to him as a spokesperson for American communism with a lot of power and reach. So what he says really does actually matter quite a bit. And the stuff he has to say is horrendous. Right. Like, I'm not, Mr. like, cancel everyone who has any kind of conservative view whatsoever. But that's what Hinkle says. It's just very old-fashioned misogynistic crap, I also feel like what I would want the American communist movement to be associated with. Like,
I don't know, man. I'm not gonna say I know that he's AstroTurf, but he feels like he came out of a lab. Like,
his story is so weird. I don't know what to make of him sometimes, but the way that people talk about him, like he actually represents a movement. Like you'll see, the Midwest Marxist will talk about there's this new American communist movement, forming, and you can join it or stay left behind in the mainstream compatible pan leftist, and you can complain about us with your purity fetish, or you can join this great new American communist movement with Jackson Hinkle as the spokesperson. It's like,
yeah, I don't know, man. Look, I have never seen these people in my city, and I have seen, for better and for worse, the PSL, the DSA, even the CPUSA sometimes. Yeah. In my city, I've never seen these people in my city.
Yeah.
And the thing is, we know how big we actually don't know how big the PSL and the CPUSA are, but we know that they're probably, between 5,000 and 10,000 people. And that the DSA is, between 60 and 80,000 people. And I see them, even though I see them in a nation of 350 million people. Whereas I've never seen these guys except on Twitter.
Yeah, but I mean, I will say they're kind of
they do stuff in the real world. So I don't want to say that they're just. And the other thing where people go, "Oh, the engagement fake," and I'm like, well, that might be true, it might not be true. I don't know. But I can tell you this: fake engagement becomes real engagement eventually.
No, I think that the strategy seems to be that, listen, we're going to kind of fight the culture war, the information war online, and then it will kind of seep into real world success. And how that happens, unless you expect it to kind of be completely stochastic and spontaneous, where people just kind of spontaneously form MAGA communist clubs or whatever because they watch Haas, and there's got to have to be some kind of plan to make it into a coherent movement. And
unless it's just going to end up like QAnon. I mean,
right. And that's, but the thing is to have a coherent movement, you need people who actually know how to organize, who have organizational skills and experience. all those people are in the mainstream left, like DSA and CPUSA and PSL, that they all have declared war on.
Yeah, I know. It's
So,
like it's like, okay, so even it's just like, I get declaring war on politicos. Like, I sometimes wish the left would declare more war on like Democrats, frankly.
Yeah.
I kind of wish we did. Like we flirt with it, but we don't. People are kind of finally doing it because of Gaza.
Yeah.
Like, there's a whole lot of people who were very soft on Democrats that at least this was a damn line.
Yeah.
But yeah, but I don't see on turning on. I don't see like, oh, we're going to turn on the entirety of the left, all these organizations. We're not going to try to run any of them over at all. I mean, let's be honest, though. They did try. Like, they tried to do entryism into CPUSA, like, or at least the patriotic socialist Magga communist prior mutation did.
That was a complete failure.
Yeah. So it's interesting to see where this all goes. So yeah, it's been nice talking to you. It's nice talking about this stuff because I think a lot of people don't really understand it. And I know that the people who believe in this are going to think we treated it unfairly, and fine. But I don't really care.
Yeah, but, I mean, I'm sure there's going to be plenty of people combing for this for some clips of us saying something that will be used as evidence that we're either soft on MAGA communism or soft on the open society, or, you know, I don't know, but whatever.
Yeah. I mean, people are going to use it for whatever. I mean, like, one of the things I've learned about being on the left for so long is I think I've been accused of being everything. I've been accused of being a Stalinist. I get accused of being a Trotskyite a lot, which
I know people call me all the time.
I guess they've never accused me of being a social democrat, so I guess, you know, that at least is clear.
Yeah, I've definitely caught the social democrat quite a few times.
I know you. Well,
kind of inevitable when you stand Kautsky, so I accept it.
Yeah. I mean, you were even say like old social democracy may be even worth looking at, like pre-19.
Well, no, I actually would be fine with calling myself a revolutionary social democrat. Like, I don't even hate the term social democracy because it's kind of a cool term. It's just we live in the 21st century, and social democracy as a movement is now essentially just the same as neoliberalism. So
yeah, I mean, it's what particularly after Bernstein's neo-Lassallean turn, and then whatever the fuck happened in the 50s where everyone became Keynesians, like it's pretty much, you know.
Yeah, post 1914, you can't call yourself a social democrat, but it's not because the term itself is like bad,
right?
You know?
Yeah. So thank you, and people can check out your work over at the Democratic Left and on Cosmonaut Magazine.
Yep.
And people should watch what Marxist Unity Group is doing, and if you're in the DSA, support it. If you have some weird hang up like I do that you can't give the DSA money until they formally make your Democrats, then help them out.
But you should join the DSA. I will say that, Barn.
I know. And
join the DSA and support Mug. And if you want to join us, when you're ready,
I'll think about it. When you actually get the DSA to adopt a program, I might. But if you're in the DSA, I think right now, actually, in a very real sense, the DSA is really being contested for what it's going to be in the future. The prior phase, the Bernie phase, is dead. It's done. You're not getting it back. Bernie's too old. That politics doesn't seem to have gone anywhere. So
a lot is up in the air right now.
Right. A lot is up in the air. So
and Mug is working on we're working on cohering a more, I guess, a cohesive programmatic vision for what we want the socialist a
Well, you guys
democratic.
at least believe in programs, like so.
Yeah, we like programs, but we're all working on kind of developing a vision, and so things are going good. Keep an eye on Mug, keep an eye on Cosmonaut, and
all right,
yeah,
what would you?
Oh dang, we almost talked for 3 hours.
Yeah, let me get this off. Come on. Boom.